I've spent 30 years trying to earn my place at that table. 30 years of silence, of swallowing insults, of pretending their laughter didn't slice through me every single time. That night at Le Bernardin, the chandeliers sparkled above us like we were some picture-perfect family. But I knew the truth. I was the stain they couldn't wash out. My brother Mark raised his champagne glass, that familiar smirk twisting his lips. "Well, look who finally showed up. Tell me, does an adopted girl like you even belong at a table like this?" The whole family burst into laughter. My mother, Celia, hid her smile behind manicured fingers. My father stared at his plate. Even Mark's wife let out a polite giggle. I sat frozen. The clink of fine crystal, the suffocating scent of expensive perfume, the heat crawling up my neck as nearby diners glanced our way. I forced a smile. What else could I do? Then I heard it one word that silenced everything. Wait. My 75-year-old grandfather set down his glass, his eyes locked on mine with an intensity I'd never seen before. There's something this family needs to know tonight. Have you ever had a single moment completely rewrite everything you believed about your life? My name is Victoria Banks. I'm 35 years old, and to the world, I'm a modest financial consultant with a small practice in Brooklyn. But beneath that simple exterior lies a more complicated truth. I was adopted into the wealthy Banks family at 5 years old after my mother died in what everyone called an accident. For 3 decades, I've lived as an outsider in my own home, trying to earn love from people who never wanted to give it. The call came at 4 that afternoon, interrupting a client meeting I'd spent weeks preparing for. Celia's name flashed across my screen and my stomach clenched the way it always does when she reaches out. "Victoria, Le Bernardin, 7 o'clock. Don't be late." The line went dead before I could ask a single question. I stared at my phone trying to make sense of it. Le Bernardin was one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, the kind of place my family frequented to remind themselves and others of their status. I hadn't been invited to a family gathering in nearly 2 years. Whatever this was about, it couldn't be good news. I arrived 5 minutes early, wearing a simple black dress I'd owned for years. The hostess guided me through the elegant dining room, past tables filled with power couples and executives, to a private corner where the Banks family sat waiting. My grandfather, Thomas, 75 years old but still commanding, occupied the head of the table. To his right sat my adoptive father, David, his expression carrying that weary look I'd come to know so well. My adoptive mother, Celia, was positioned opposite him, her silver jewellery catching the candlelight, her posture perfect as always. And there was Mark, my adoptive brother, 40 years old, and radiating the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything. His wife Stephanie sat beside him, her smile polite but distant. Mark spotted me first, his lips curled into that familiar smirk. "Well, look who finally decided to grace us with her presence. I thought you'd be working your night shift at some sad little office somewhere." Celia covered her mouth, but I caught the amusement in her eyes. David studied his water glass as though it contained the secrets of the universe. Stephanie offered a tight smile that meant nothing. I took my seat without a word. I had learnt long ago that responding to Mark only made things worse. 30 years of practice had taught me how to make my face a mask, even when every word landed like a blow. The conversation moved on without me. Mark announced his recent promotion to CFO at Banks Enterprises, and Celia beamed with maternal pride. They discussed their upcoming vacation to the south of France, 3 weeks, in a villa overlooking the Mediterranean. No one asked if I wanted to join. No one even glanced in my direction. I watched them from across the table, these people who called themselves my family. I observed the easy way they laughed together, the casual touches, the shared history in every reference. I was sitting among them, yet I might as well have been invisible. Then something unexpected happened. Grandfather Thomas, who had been unusually quiet all evening, set down his wine glass. The sound it made against the table was soft, but something in the gesture commanded attention. He tapped the crystal once, twice, and the conversation died. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the lingering chatter. Everyone turned to look at him. Even Mark, mid-sentence about some business deal, fell silent. Thomas's eyes swept across the table, pausing briefly on each face. When his gaze reached mine, something shifted in his expression. A softness I rarely saw, a tenderness that made my breath catch. "I called this dinner for a reason," he continued. "There is something important I need to tell all of you. Something that cannot wait any longer." Celia leaned forward, her perfectly shaped eyebrows drawing together. Mark exchanged a glance with Stephanie. David's hand tightened around his napkin, and I sat there heart-pounding, wondering why my grandfather was looking at me as though I were the only person in the room who mattered. What was he about to say? And why did I have the strangest feeling that everything I knew about my life was about to change? The silence that followed my grandfather's words hung in the air like smoke. I could feel everyone's attention shifting, trying to understand what was happening. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a cream-coloured envelope, thick and official-looking, the kind that lawyers use for important documents. "I have just completed revisions to my will," he said, placing the envelope on the table in front of him. "I want all of you to know the contents before I'm gone. There should be no surprises, no confusion, no room for anyone to claim they did not understand my wishes." Mark leaned back in his chair, a confident smile spreading across his face. I knew that look well. He had spent his entire life being groomed as the heir to the bank's fortune, and he had no doubt that whatever was in that envelope would confirm his position. Celia reached over and squeezed David's hand, her eyes bright with anticipation. She probably assumed this was the moment her sacrifices would finally be rewarded, the moment her son would be officially crowned. David said nothing. His face remained unreadable, but I noticed his jaw tighten slightly. Thomas opened the envelope and removed several sheets of paper. He did not look at them. He had clearly memorized every word. "The main assets of the bank's family include the ancestral home on the Upper East Side, controlling shares in bank's enterprises, and various investments totaling approximately $47 million. He paused, letting those numbers sink in. I had always known the family was wealthy, but hearing it stated so plainly still took my breath away. "These assets will be divided as follows," Thomas continued. His voice was steady, almost formal, like a judge delivering a verdict. "Mark Banks will receive 15%. David Banks will receive 15%. Mark's smile flickered. 15% was not what he had expected. Celia's grip on David's hand tightened, her knuckles going white. Thomas turned to look directly at me. "Victoria Banks will receive 70% of all assets, along with full management authority over bank's enterprises and final decision-making power regarding the family estate." For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The words seemed to hang in the air, impossible to process. I felt my heart stop, then restart with a painful thud. 70%. Full management authority. I must have misheard. There was no way my grandfather had just said what I thought he said. Then the chaos erupted. Mark slammed both hands on the table so hard that the silverware jumped. "You have lost your mind." His face had turned a deep shade of red, the veins in his neck bulging. "She is adopted. She does not have a single drop of Banks' blood in her veins. How can you give her everything while your own grandson gets scraps?" Celia shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the floor with an ugly sound. Her face had gone completely white, all colour drained away. "Father, you cannot do this." "You simply cannot. I have sacrificed my entire life for this family. I have dedicated myself to maintaining our reputation, our standing in society, and you would give everything to her." She pointed at me, her finger trembling with rage. "To the girl we took in out of charity." I sat frozen in my seat, unable to speak, unable to move. This had to be some kind of mistake, some kind of cruel joke. I looked at my grandfather, waiting for him to laugh and tell everyone he was just testing them, but his expression remained serious, even serene. Stephanie had pressed herself back in her chair, clearly wanting to disappear. David still had not said a word. I glanced at him, expecting to see the same shock that gripped everyone else. But his face showed something different. He did not look surprised at all. If anything, he looked resigned, as though he had known this moment was coming. "This is insane!" Mark was shouting now, not caring that other diners were turning to stare. "She has done nothing for this family. I have worked at Banks Enterprises for 15 years. I am the CFO. I have earned my place." "Have you?" Thomas asked quietly. The question cut through Mark's ranting like a knife. "Have you truly earned it, Mark? Or have you simply taken what you believed was already yours?" Mark sputtered, momentarily thrown off balance. Celia seized the opportunity to press her attack. "Father, please, think about what you are doing. Think about our family legacy. Victoria is not one of us. She never has been. You cannot hand over everything our ancestors built to someone who shares nothing with us." Thomas raised his hand, and something in the gesture commanded immediate silence. Even Mark stopped mid-sentence, his mouth still open. My grandfather had always possessed that kind of authority, the ability to quiet a room with the smallest movement. "I am completely lucid," Thomas said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone lean forward. "I have undergone medical evaluation to confirm my mental competency. The documents are signed, witnessed, and legally unassailable. These are my final wishes, and they will be honoured." He paused, letting his words settle over the table like a heavy blanket. Then he turned to look at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before. It was more than affection, more than the distant fondness of a grandfather for his grandchild. It was something deeper, something almost painful. "Victoria," he said softly, "there are things you have never known. Things about your mother, about how you came to be part of this family, about why I have watched over you all these years. I have kept these secrets to protect you, but the time for protection has passed." He reached across the table and took my hand. His skin was paper thin, spotted with age, but his grip was surprisingly strong. "It is time you learnt the truth about your origins. And once you know, you will understand why I trust you above everyone else in this room." I wanted to ask what he meant. I wanted to demand answers right there at the table, but the words would not come. All I could do was stare at this man who had been the only source of warmth in my cold childhood, wondering what secrets he had carried for 30 years. What did he know about my mother? What truth about my origins could possibly justify giving me 70% of the bank's fortune? And why, when I looked at the fury on Mark and Celia's faces, did I feel like I had just become the target in a war I never knew existed? My grandfather's words echoed in my mind, and suddenly I was not sitting in that expensive restaurant anymore. I was somewhere else, entirely pulled back through time to a memory I had tried so hard to bury. The day I first walked into the bank's mansion. The day my old life ended and this strange, painful existence began. I was 5 years old. I remember clutching a small suitcase in one hand and a worn teddy bear in the other. The bear had been a gift from my mother, the last thing she ever gave me. Its fur was matted and one eye was missing, but I held on to it like it was the most precious thing in the world. Because it was. It was all I had left of her. My mother had died 3 days earlier in a car accident. That is what they told me anyway. A social worker with tired eyes and a gentle voice had explained that Mommy had gone to heaven and would not be coming back. I did not understand death at 5. I kept asking when she would pick me up. I kept waiting by the window of the foster care office, convinced she would appear at any moment, smiling that warm smile ready to take me home. She never came. I had no father, at least none that anyone knew about. My mother had never spoken of him, and there was no name on my birth certificate. No grandparents, no aunts or uncles, no cousins. I was completely alone in the world, a little girl with nothing but a broken teddy bear and a suitcase full of clothes that were already too small. Then the Banks family appeared. I did not know why they had agreed to adopt me. I did not understand the connections or the arrangements. All I knew was that a tall woman with perfect hair and cold eyes came to collect me, and I was told that these people would be my new family. The mansion took my breath away. I had never seen a house so large. It had tall, white columns and windows that seemed to stretch forever. The lawn was perfectly green, the hedges trimmed into neat shapes. Everything was clean and beautiful and terrifying. Celia stood at the front door waiting for us. She wore a cream-coloured dress and pearls around her neck, and her smile was the kind that did not reach her eyes. She looked at me the way someone might look at a stain on an expensive carpet, something unpleasant that needed to be dealt with. "So this is her," she said, not to me but to the social worker. "Fine, we will take it from here." She led me inside without touching me, walking quickly, so I had to run to keep up. The house smelled like flowers and furniture polish. Our footsteps echoed on the marble floors. I wanted to ask questions, but something told me I should stay quiet. Celia stopped in front of a door at the end of a long hallway. "This is your room," she said, her voice flat. "There are rules you need to understand. Do not make noise. Do not touch anything that does not belong to you, especially Mark's things. And when we have guests, stay in your room and do not bother anyone. Is that clear?" I nodded, too scared to speak. "Good." She turned and walked away without another word. I pushed open the door to my new room. It was small, much smaller than the other rooms I had glimpsed along the hallway. The walls were bare and the furniture was plain. But there was a bed with clean sheets, and after 3 nights on a cot in the foster care office, that seemed like a miracle. I set my suitcase down and sat on the edge of the bed, still holding my teddy bear. That is when I heard footsteps on the stairs and looked up to see a boy standing in the hallway, staring at me through the open door. Mark was 10 years old then, but he already had that look of superiority that would define him for the rest of his life. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, studying me like I was some kind of insect. "Mum," he called out, not taking his eyes off me. "Why do we have to keep her? My friends are going to laugh at me. She looks poor." Celia's voice drifted from somewhere down the hall. "Because your grandfather insisted. Now leave her alone and go do your homework." Mark rolled his eyes and walked away, but not before shooting me one last look of disgust. I sat on that bed for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, too confused to cry. The teddy bear in my arms was the only familiar thing in this strange new world. Then I heard different footsteps. Heavier, slower, but somehow warmer. A man appeared in my doorway and, unlike everyone else I had met that day, he actually smiled when he saw me. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that was just starting to grey at the temples. His eyes were kind but sad, like he carried some heavy weight that nobody else could see. He walked into my room slowly, carefully, the way you might approach a frightened animal. Then, he did something nobody else had done. He knelt down so that his eyes were level with mine. He looked at me directly, really seeing me for the first time since I had arrived. "What is your name, little one?" he asked. His voice was deep but gentle. "Victoria," I whispered. "Victoria, sir." His smile widened. "Victoria, do you know that is a queen's name? A name for someone strong and brave." He paused and I saw his eyes move across my face, as if he was searching for something. "Your mother was the bravest woman I ever knew, and I made her a promise that I would protect you. Do you understand?" I did not understand, not then, but I nodded anyway because his words made me feel something I had not felt since my mother died. They made me feel safe. The memory faded, and I was back in the restaurant, my grandfather's aged hand still holding mine. The same kind eyes now surrounded by wrinkles. The same sad smile. "You knew my mother?" The question came out barely above a whisper. How did you know her? And what promise had he made that kept him watching over me for 30 years? My grandfather did not answer immediately. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see the weight of years pressing down on him. The restaurant noise faded into the background as everyone at our table waited. Even Mark had stopped his angry muttering. Even Celia had lowered herself back into her chair, her face still pale but her eyes now sharp with curiosity. "I did not just know your mother, Victoria," Thomas finally said. His voice had changed. It was heavier now, thick with emotion he was struggling to control. "Margaret saved my life. She saved this company. She saved everything that these people sitting around this table are now fighting over." The name hit me like a physical blow. Margaret, my mother's name. I had so few memories of her, just fragments, really. The smell of her perfume, the sound of her laughter, the way she would stroke my hair when I was falling asleep. But her name spoken aloud by someone else brought a flood of feeling I was not prepared for. "What do you mean she saved you?" I managed to ask. Thomas released my hand and leaned back in his chair. He suddenly looked every one of his 75 years, his shoulders hunched, his face drawn. 38 years ago, I was facing the end of everything. Prison, disgrace, the complete destruction of the bank's name and fortune. He paused to take a breath. I was accused of fraud, securities violations, crimes that carried sentences of 20 years or more. And I was innocent, Victoria, completely innocent. But the evidence had been manufactured so carefully, so perfectly, that even my own lawyers were advising me to plead guilty and hope for mercy. Mark shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. This was family history he had probably never heard. Celia's expression had shifted from anger to something else, something almost like fear. "Your mother was a young lawyer then," Thomas continued. "Just a few years out of law school, working at a small firm that handled cases for people who could not afford the big corporate attorneys. She had nothing to gain by helping me. I was not her client. I could not pay her fees. But somehow she learned about my case, and she became convinced that something was wrong, that the evidence did not add up." He stopped speaking for a moment, lost in the memory. When he resumed, his voice was quieter, almost reverent. "Margaret spent 6 months of her life proving my innocence. 6 months of working without pay, without recognition, without any guarantee of success. She dug through thousands of documents. She tracked down witnesses who had been paid to disappear. She uncovered a conspiracy that went all the way to the top of one of the most powerful financial firms in New York." I tried to picture my mother as this fierce young lawyer fighting against impossible odds. It was so different from the gentle woman in my bad, fragmented memories, the one who sang lullabies and made pancakes on Sunday mornings. She risked everything, Thomas said. Her career, her reputation, her safety. The people she was exposing were dangerous. They had money connections power. They threatened her. They tried to bribe her. When that did not work, they tried to destroy her professionally. His hands clenched on the tablecloth. But she never stopped. She never gave up. And in the end, she won. She proved my innocence and brought down the men who had tried to frame me. She saved my life, my freedom, my family legacy. The table was completely silent. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "The full story is in documents I've kept all these years," Thomas said. "Letters, court records, evidence files. Everything. You will read them when I am stronger, when we have time to go through it all together. But for now, I need you to understand the debt I owe. The debt this entire family owes to Margaret Reynolds. Reynolds, my mother's maiden name. The name I had chosen for my own company without ever truly understanding why it felt so right." Then Thomas said something that made my blood run cold. "The car accident that killed your mother," he began, and I saw his eyes fill with tears for the first time that night. "I have never believed it was an accident, Victoria. The people she exposed, the men she brought down, they had connections that stretched into places no one could see. Some of them went to prison, but others escaped justice. They had money, hidden away allies in dark corners. My chest tightened. I had always accepted my mother's death as a tragedy, a terrible twist of fate. Now my grandfather was suggesting something far worse. I have spent decades investigating, he continued, his voice breaking slightly. Hiring private detectives, tracking down leads, trying to find proof of what I have always suspected. But these people were careful. They covered their tracks too well. I could never find enough evidence to bring to a court. A single tear rolled down his weathered cheek. I failed her, Victoria. I could not get justice for the woman who saved me. But I swear to you now in front of everyone at this table, I will not fail you. I will protect you the way I should have protected her. I wanted to say something, but my throat had closed up. 30 years of believing my mother's death was random, meaningless, and now this. Now the possibility that she had been murdered for her courage, for her integrity, for doing what was right. Thomas reached out and touched my face gently, tilting my chin up so he could look at me more closely. You have your mother's eyes, he said softly. The same determination, the same fire. But that stubborn chin of yours. He stopped abruptly as if catching himself before saying something he should not. His hand dropped away and he looked down at the table. What about my chin? I asked. What were you going to say? But Thomas just shook his head, pressing his lips together. Nothing. It is nothing. I'm tired, that is all. We should finish dinner. I stared at him, certain he was hiding something. The way he had looked at me, the way his eyes had searched my face as if looking for traces of someone else. What had he been about to reveal? Mark broke the tension with a harsh laugh. This is touching, really. A lovely bedtime story, but none of it changes the facts. She is still adopted. She is still an outsider, and no amount of ancient history changes that. Celia nodded vigorously. Mark is right. Whatever happened 40 years ago has nothing to do with the inheritance. Father, you cannot give away our family's fortune based on sentimentality. But I was not listening to them anymore. I was watching my grandfather, watching the way he avoided my eyes, wondering what secret he was still keeping. What had he almost said about my chin, and what did it have to do with the truth about my origins? The dinner fell apart after that. Whatever appetite anyone might have had vanished completely. The waiter approached our table twice to take orders, and twice he was waved away by sharp gestures from Celia. The beautiful restaurant with its crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths had become a battlefield, and nobody was interested in food anymore. Mark threw his napkin onto the table with a violent motion. He stood up so quickly that his chair nearly toppled backward. Without a word, without even looking at anyone, he stormed up toward the exit. His footsteps were heavy and angry against the polished floor. Other diners turned to watch him go, their faces showing the kind of polite curiosity that wealthy people reserve for public scenes they want to pretend they are not enjoying. Stephanie remained seated for a moment longer. She was gathering her purse, preparing to follow her husband, but before she stood, she looked at me. It was a strange look, different from any she had given me before. For 5 years, I had known this woman, and she had always treated me with the same distant politeness she might show a household servant. Pleasant enough on the surface, but with a clear understanding that I was beneath her. Now, something had shifted behind her eyes. She was recalculating, reassessing. I could almost see the numbers running through her mind. 70% of the bank's fortune, full management authority. Suddenly, the adopted sister-in-law she had dismissed for years looked very different. I caught her gaze and held it, and she quickly looked away, a faint flush rising to her cheeks. Then she stood and hurried after Mark without saying goodbye. Celia rose next, her movements stiff and controlled. She was trying to maintain her dignity, I could tell. She would not make a scene like her son. She would not storm out in front of all these people who knew her name, who attended her charity events, who considered her a pillar of society, but her face told a different story. Behind that careful mask, rage was burning. "David," she said, her voice clipped and cold. "We are leaving." My adoptive father stood slowly. He had barely spoken a word since Thomas made his announcement. His face was tired, resigned, like a man who'd been expecting a storm and was simply waiting for it to pass. He nodded once to Thomas, then to me, and followed his wife toward the door. Thomas remained seated, looking exhausted, but somehow at peace. "I should speak with the manager about the bill," he said quietly. "Why don't you get some air, Victoria? I will meet you outside in a few minutes." I nodded and made my way through the restaurant alone. My legs felt unsteady and my mind was spinning with everything I had just learned. My mother was not just some anonymous woman who had died in an accident. She was a hero. She had saved my grandfather's life, his company, his reputation, and she might have been murdered for it. The night air was cool against my face as I stepped outside. The valet station was off to my right, where well-dressed couples waited for their expensive cars to be brought around. I moved in the opposite direction, seeking shadows, seeking silence, seeking a moment to process everything. That is when I heard them. Celia and David were standing near the corner of the building, partially hidden by a large decorative planter. They did not know I was there. They did not know anyone could hear them. "The old man has completely lost his mind." Celia's voice was venomous, all pretense of composure abandoned. 30 years, David. 30 years I have tolerated that girl in my house. I fed her, clothed her, gave her a roof over her head when nobody else wanted her. And now she takes everything. Everything we have worked for. We. David's voice was weary. "What exactly have you worked for, Celia? You have spent 30 years hosting parties and serving on committees. Thomas built that company. Thomas made that fortune. How dare you?" The words were like ice. "I have dedicated my life to this family, to your family. I gave up my own career to raise your son, to maintain our social position, to make sure the bank's name meant something in this city." "And what about Victoria?" David asked. "What did you ever give her besides a room at the end of a hallway and a list of rules?" "She was never supposed to be permanent." Celia's voice rose dangerously. "She was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, a favour to your father's guilty conscience. She was not supposed to become the heir to everything." I pressed myself against the wall, barely breathing. 30 years of wondering why Celia treated me the way she did. 30 years of hoping that if I was good enough, quiet enough, invisible enough, she might someday accept me. Now I had my answer. She had never intended to keep me at all. "I warned you," David said. "Years ago, I told you that Thomas would never forget what he owed Margaret. I told you that Victoria would always be special to him. You chose not to listen. You are taking her side." Celia's voice dropped to a hiss, somehow more frightening than her shouting. "Your own wife, the mother of your son, and you are taking the side of that adopted nothing." "I am not taking sides. I am telling you the truth. Thomas made his decision. Fighting it will only make things worse." "I will not accept this." Celia was trembling with fury. "I will fight this until my last breath. There has to be a way. Lawyers, doctors, something. We can prove he is not competent. We can prove she manipulated him. I will not let that girl steal what belongs to my son." I heard footsteps, then moving away toward the valet station. I remained in the shadows, my heart pounding, my eyes stinging with tears I refused to let fall. 30 years. 30 years I had tried to earn their love, their acceptance, their recognition that I was part of this family. And all along, Celia had been waiting for me to disappear. All along, I had been nothing more than an inconvenience she was forced to tolerate. I was still standing there, lost in that painful realization, when I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder. I turned to find Thomas behind me, his face lined with concern. "You heard them," he said. It was not a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Are you angry with me?" he asked softly. For keeping secrets all these years, for not telling you sooner about your mother, about everything. I thought about the question. Was I angry? I had every right to be. He had known things about my mother, about my past, that I had spent my entire life wondering about. But looking at his face now, seeing the love and guilt written in every wrinkle, I could not find anger. No, I said finally. I am not angry. I'm just sad that my mother is not here for me to thank her. Thomas pulled me into an embrace, holding me tightly. I felt his body trembling slightly, felt the weight of secrets he was still carrying. What was Celia planning? How far would she go to destroy me? I drove back to Brooklyn that night with my grandfather's embrace still warm in my memory, and Celia's venomous words still echoing in my ears. The city lights blurred past my window as I navigated the familiar streets. And by the time I pulled into my usual parking spot, it was nearly midnight. My apartment building was nothing special. A modest brick structure in a working-class neighborhood, the kind of place where people minded their own business and nobody asked too many questions. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my small 1-bedroom unit and let myself in, dropping my keys on the counter and kicking off my shoes. This was the Victoria that my family knew. The struggling consultant in her tiny apartment, driving a 10-year-old Honda wearing clothes from discount stores. They saw what they expected to see, what they wanted to see. A charity case, a burden they had graciously carried for 30 years, someone who could never threaten their position or their wealth. They had no idea how wrong they were. I walked to my bedroom closet and pushed aside the row of simple blouses and practical slacks. Behind them was a small safe built into the wall, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. I entered the combination and pulled out a slim leather portfolio. Inside were documents that told a very different story about Victoria Banks. Reynolds Financial Consulting, a boutique firm specializing in investment strategy for small businesses and startups. 12 employees working out of a sleek office space in Lower Manhattan. Annual revenue of just over $2 million and growing every year. On paper, the company was run by my trusted partner James Chen, who served as the public-facing CEO. But the real decisions, the real strategy, the real vision all came from V, Reynolds Managing Director. Me. I had built this company from nothing over the past decade. Every client I had won, every deal I had closed, every dollar I had earned came from my own intelligence and hard work. No family connections, no bank's money. No one even knew I was connected to that name. I used my mother's maiden name deliberately, partly to honour her memory, but mostly to keep my 2 lives completely separate. Everything was legal, every tax properly filed, every regulation followed, every business practice above board. I simply chose to keep my success private, and I had very good reasons for that choice. I closed the safe and sat down on my bed, letting my mind drift back 12 years to when I learned the most important lesson of my life. I was 23 then, fresh out of business school, working my first real job at a mid-sized consulting firm. My salary was modest but steady, and for the first time in my life, I had money that was truly my own. Mark found out somehow. Maybe he saw a bank statement, maybe he overheard a phone call. It did not matter how. What mattered was that he showed up at my apartment one evening with a desperate look in his eyes and a story about a business opportunity that could not wait. He needed $15,000 just for a few weeks, just until his own funds cleared. He would pay me back with interest. Family, helping family right. I was young and stupid and still desperately hoping to be accepted. So I gave him the money. Every dollar I had managed to save in my first year of real work, handed over in a single check. 3 months later, when I finally gathered the courage to ask for repayment, Mark laughed in my face. He actually laughed. Then he told Celia, and she called me into her sitting room for a conversation I would never forget. "You want Mark to repay you?" she had said, her eyebrows raised in that condescending way of hers. "After everything this family has done for you, We fed you, clothed, you educated, you gave you opportunities you never would have had otherwise. That $15,000 is not a loan, Victoria. Consider it the beginning of your debt to us, a debt you will never fully repay. I left that room with my face burning and my heart broken, but I also left with a new understanding of how this family worked. They would take whatever they could from me and call it their due. They would use my gratitude as a weapon against me forever, unless I gave them nothing to take. From that day forward, I became invisible. I dressed simply. I drove cheap cars. I lived in small apartments. I never spoke about my work or my income. When family dinners came around, which was rare, I deflected questions with vague answers about struggling to make ends meet. Mark would smirk. Celia would sigh with false sympathy, and I would smile and let them believe whatever they wanted to believe. Meanwhile, I was building an empire they knew nothing about. My phone rang, pulling me out of the memory. I glanced at the screen and felt a genuine smile cross my face for the first time all night. Eleanor Whitfield. Sweetheart, her warm voice came through the speaker. I heard what happened tonight. Thomas called me as soon as he got home. He finally told you the truth about your mother. Some of it, I said, settling back against my pillows. I think there is still more he is holding back. Eleanor was 72 years old, sharp as a razor, and had been my grandfather's closest friend for 4 decades. She was also the person who had secretly mentored me in the business world, introducing me to contacts, advising me on strategy, helping me build Reynolds Financial without ever breathing a word to anyone in the bank's family. There is always more with Thomas, she agreed. That man carries secrets like other people carry wallets. She paused and her tone shifted to something more serious. But that is not why I am calling. You need to prepare yourself, Victoria. Celia is not going to accept this. She will fight, and she will fight dirty. I know. I heard her tonight talking to David. She is already planning something. It is worse than you think? Eleanor's voice dropped lower. There is something about Celia you do not know. Something that happened a long time ago when you first came to live with the Banks family. Thomas made me promise never to tell you, but given what is about to happen, I think you need to be warned. My grip tightened on the phone. Oh, what are you talking about? What did she do? Not over the phone, Eleanor said. Meet me tomorrow for lunch. There are things you need to hear, and they should be said face to face. She hung up before I could ask anything more, leaving me alone in my small apartment with a growing sense of dread. What had Celia done? And what was Eleanor so afraid to tell me? I did not know it then, but while I was lying awake that night wondering about Eleanor's cryptic warning, my enemies were already moving against me. I would learn the details later, pieced together from conversations overheard and documents discovered. But for now, let me tell you what was happening in the shadows while I slept. The morning after the dinner, Celia Banks sat in the mahogany-panelled office of Richard Hartley, one of Manhattan's most expensive lawyers specialising in inheritance disputes. His client list read like a directory of old money families, people who had been fighting over fortunes for generations. He charged $800 an hour and was worth every penny if you needed to bend the law without quite breaking it. Celia had dressed carefully for this meeting. A conservative navy suit, tasteful pearls, minimal makeup. She wanted to look like a concerned family member, not a greedy daughter-in-law. She had rehearsed her story on the drive over the tale of a vulnerable old man manipulated by a scheming adopted daughter. Is there any way to invalidate the will? She asked, leaning forward in her chair. Any legal grounds at all? Hartley studied the documents. She had brought copies of the will that Thomas's lawyer had provided to all family members as a courtesy. His face remained impassive as he read, giving nothing away. Finally, he set the papers down and steepled his fingers. Difficult, he said. Very difficult. Thomas Banks is clearly mentally competent. He has recent medical certification confirming his cognitive abilities. The will was witnessed by 2 independent parties, and it was prepared by Catherine Wells, one of the most respected estate attorneys in the city. Challenging it on procedural grounds would be nearly impossible. Celia's jaw tightened. There must be something. He is 75 years old. He has had health problems. Surely we can argue that his judgment is impaired. We could try, Hartley acknowledged. But Thomas anticipated that possibility. The medical evaluation was conducted specifically to prevent such challenges. 3 different doctors signed off on his mental competency. Any judge would dismiss a capacity challenge immediately. Then, what can we do? Celia demanded, her careful composure beginning to crack. Hartley was silent for a moment, choosing his next words carefully. There is one possible avenue. If we could demonstrate that Victoria Banks exercised undue influence over Thomas, that she manipulated him psychologically to change his will in her favour, we might have grounds for a challenge. It would require evidence that she isolated him from other family members, controlled his access to information, or used emotional manipulation to alter his decisions. Celia's eyes lit up. She has always been his favourite, always whispering in his ear, turning him against us. That is a narrative, Hartley said. But narratives require evidence. Do you have any witnesses, documents, recordings? The light in Celia's eyes dimmed. She had accusations, suspicions, resentments. What she did not have was proof. There is another option. Hartley continued, his voice dropping slightly. One that avoids the courts entirely. If Victoria were to voluntarily renounce her inheritance, no legal challenge would be necessary. A signed statement of renunciation would be binding and irrevocable. No, she would never do that willingly. Perhaps not. Hartley let the words hang in the air. But people can be persuaded, pressured, made to feel that renunciation is in their best interest. If she were to believe that accepting the inheritance would bring her nothing but pain, she might choose to walk away. Celia understood perfectly. The lawyer was not explicitly suggesting anything illegal. He was simply pointing out that there were ways to make someone give up what was rightfully theirs, ways that did not involve courts or judges. While Celia was plotting psychological warfare, her son was dealing with a more immediate crisis. Mark Banks sat alone in his corner office at Banks Enterprises, the door locked, the blinds drawn. His computer screen glowed in the dim room as he systematically deleted files from the company server. For 5 years, Mark had been siphoning money from the company. Small amounts at first, a few thousand here and there, easy to hide in the complex web of corporate finances. But the amounts had grown larger as his gambling debts mounted, as his lifestyle exceeded his legitimate income, as his sense of entitlement convinced him that he was only taking what should have been his anyway. $1.8 million. That was the total spread across dozens of transactions buried in fake consulting fees and inflated expense reports. Mark had always assumed that when Thomas died, he would inherit control of the company and could quietly make the discrepancies disappear. No one would ever look too closely at the books of a family business passing from one generation to the next. But now Victoria was going to inherit 70% and full management authority. Victoria, who had built her own consulting business. Victoria, who understood financial statements the way most people understood their native language. If she took control and ordered an audit, everything would come out. The theft, the fraud, the years of betrayal. Mark would go to prison. His career would be destroyed. His family would be ruined. Everything he had worked for, everything he believed he deserved would be taken away. He could not let that happen. Mark picked up his phone and dialed a number he had hoped never to use. Henry Foster answered on the 3rd ring. Foster was a former FBI financial investigator who had left government service to become a private consultant. He specialised in digging up information that people wanted to keep buried. His methods were not always legal, but his results were reliable. "I need everything you can find on someone," Mark said without preamble. Victoria Banks, also known as Victoria Reynolds. I want to know where she works, who she knows what she owns, every secret, every weakness, every skeleton in her closet. Foster named his fee. It was steep, more than Mark could easily afford given his current financial troubles. But desperation has a way of making expensive things seem like bargains. "Do it," Mark said. "I need results fast." 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived at Mark's office marked confidential. He tore it open with trembling hands and began to read. What he found inside would change everything. What secrets had Henry Foster uncovered, and how would Mark use them against me? 1 week passed after the fateful dinner. 7 days of tense silence, of unreturned phone calls to my grandfather, of growing unease that something was wrong. I had tried to reach Thomas several times, but each call went to voicemail. When I contacted the house, the staff told me he was resting and could not be disturbed. I told myself he was simply recovering from the emotional strain of the dinner. I told myself he needed time alone. I was wrong. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my office at Reynolds Financial reviewing quarterly projections with James when my personal phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something made me answer immediately. "Is this Victoria Banks?" The voice was professional clinical. "Yes." "This is Mount Sinai Hospital. Your grandfather, Thomas Banks, was admitted to our emergency room approximately 1 hour ago. He has suffered a stroke. His condition is stable, but serious. You are listed as his emergency contact." The words hit me like a physical blow. I do not remember ending the call. I do not remember grabbing my coat or running to the elevator. The next clear memory I have is of driving through Manhattan traffic, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my heart pounding against my ribs. A stroke. Thomas had suffered a stroke. The man who had been my only source of warmth for 30 years. The man who had just revealed secrets about my mother that changed everything I understood about my life. He was lying in a hospital bed, and I had not even known he was ill. I abandoned my car with a valet and ran through the hospital entrance. The fluorescent lights were harsh, the smell of antiseptic, overwhelming. I found the information desk and practically shouted my grandfather's name. The receptionist, clearly accustomed to frantic family members, calmly directed me to the cardiac care unit on the 4th floor. The elevator ride felt like an eternity. When the doors finally opened, I rushed down the corridor, scanning room numbers, searching for any sign of my grandfather. Then I saw them, and my steps faltered. Celia stood in the hallway outside one of the rooms, positioned like a guard dog, protecting her territory. Her arms were crossed, her face set in hard lines. When she saw me approaching, her expression shifted to something between contempt and triumph. "What are you doing here?" she demanded before I could speak. I received a call from the hospital. Thomas listed me as his emergency contact. I tried to step around her, but she moved to block my path. "You do not need to be here. This is family business. The real family is handling it." I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and unfamiliar. For 30 years, I had swallowed insults, absorbed cruelty, accepted my place as the unwanted outsider. But not today. Not with my grandfather lying in a hospital bed on the other side of that door. He is my grandfather. I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I have every right to be here. Celia laughed a sharp and ugly sound. "He is my father-in-law. He is David's father, Mark's grandfather. You are just the stray he brought home out of guilt. You have no blood connection to this family, no legal standing, no right to be anywhere near him." The hospital seems to disagree. They called me first. Her face flushed with rage. "That will be corrected. I will make sure of it." We stood there in the sterile hospital corridor, 2 women locked in a battle that had been building for 3 decades. I refused to back down, refused to lower my eyes, refused to shrink into the invisible girl I had been trained to be. Then a voice came from behind Celia. "Let her in." We both turned. David stood in the doorway of Thomas's room, his face drawn and tired, but his eyes showing something I had rarely seen. Determination. Authority. "David," Celia began, her voice sharp with warning. "I said, let her in." He did not raise his voice, but there was steel in it. "Thomas will want to see her. He has been asking for her since he regained consciousness." Celia stared at her husband as if she had never seen him before. In all my years with this family, I had never witnessed David directly contradict his wife. He had always been passive, yielding the quiet presence, who went along with whatever Celia decided. But something had changed. Something had shifted in him that I did not yet understand. "Fine," Celia spat, "but this is not over." She stepped aside and I moved past her into the hospital room. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. Thomas looked small in the hospital bed, surrounded by beeping monitors and tangled wires. His face was pale, one side slightly drooping. But when his eyes found mine, they were clear and alert. He tried to smile, managing only a crooked half expression, but it was enough. "Victoria?" His voice was weak, strained, but I could hear him clearly. "Come here, child." I crossed to his bedside and took his hand. His grip surprised me, with its strength, his fingers closing around mine with desperate urgency. "Listen carefully," he said, speaking slowly but deliberately. "I do not know how much time I have left. Days, weeks, maybe months. But you need to be prepared. Grandfather, please, you need to rest." "No." His eyes burned with intensity. "There is no more time for resting. You must go to my study. My desk has a secret drawer underneath on the left side. Press the panel and it will open. Inside, you will find a wooden box." A wooden box. Everything you need is in that box. Documents, letters, evidence. Things I have been collecting for 30 years. His grip tightened further. "You have been silent too long, Victoria. You have let them treat you like you do not matter. But you do matter. You matter more than any of them know." "What do you mean?" "The box will explain everything. But promise me this." His eyes locked onto mine with desperate urgency. "Promise me you will stop being silent. Promise me you will protect yourself. They are coming for you, Victoria. Celia, Mark. They will try to destroy you. You must be ready to fight back." I nodded, tears blurring my vision. "I promise." He relaxed slightly, sinking back into his pillows. "Go tonight. Do not wait." What was in that wooden box? What secrets had my grandfather been keeping for 30 years? I waited until after midnight. The Banks family mansion sat dark and quiet on its manicured lawn, the only light coming from a single lamp in the front hallway that the staff always left on. I knew the house schedule as well as anyone. The live-in housekeeper retired to her quarters by 10. Celia and David would still be at the hospital, keeping vigil over Thomas for appearances, if nothing else. Mark and Stephanie had their own home across town. I parked my car 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, staying in the shadows out of habit more than necessity. The spare key was still hidden in the same spot it had been for 30 years, tucked inside a fake rock near the garden shed. The family had never bothered to change their security routines. Why would they? They never imagined that the quiet, obedient adopted daughter would ever do anything unexpected. The front door opened silently. I slipped inside and stood for a moment in the darkened foyer, letting my eyes adjust. The house smelled the same as it always had: furniture, polish, and fresh flowers, and something else underneath, something cold and impersonal that I had never been able to identify. This was not a home. It was a showplace, a monument to wealth and status. It had never felt like mine, not even for a single day of the 30 years I had lived here. I made my way to Thomas's study on the 2nd floor. The door was unlocked, and I stepped inside, closing it behind me. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the room in pale silver. I could see the massive oak desk where my grandfather had worked for decades, the leather chair worn smooth from years of use. The walls lined with books he had actually read rather than displayed for decoration. I crossed to the desk and knelt beside it, running my hands along the left side panel. For a moment, I felt nothing but smooth wood. Then, my fingers found a slight irregularity, a seam that was almost invisible to the eye. I pressed, and something clicked. A hidden drawer slid open, revealing a space I had never known existed, despite sitting beside this desk countless times over the years. Inside was a wooden box, simple and unadorned, about the size of a shoebox. I lifted it out carefully, feeling its weight, sensing somehow that what lay inside would change everything. I carried it to the window, where the moonlight was strongest, and sat down on the floor with it in my lap. The lid opened easily. Inside were documents, dozens of them, organised into neat sections with handwritten labels. My grandfather had always been meticulous, and even his secrets were carefully filed. The first section contained financial records, spreadsheets, bank statements, transaction logs. As I flipped through them, patterns began to emerge. Money moving from banks' enterprises accounts to an offshore holding company. The same amounts appearing days later in personal accounts belonging to Mark Banks. Dates, figures, routing numbers. Everything documented with the precision of a professional auditor. My grandfather had been tracking Mark's theft for years, building a case that would be impossible to deny. The second section made my heart stop. Letters, old and yellowed, written on paper that crackled when I touched it. The handwriting was feminine, elegant, unfamiliar. I turned to the first one and began to read. Dear Thomas, I cannot thank you enough for your kind words after the trial. Your friendship means more to me than I can express. It was signed Margaret Reynolds. My mother's name. My mother's handwriting. I leafed through the letters quickly, my hands trembling. There were dozens of them, spanning several years. They spoke of friendship, gratitude, professional admiration. Near the end, the tone shifted to something warmer, more personal. The final letter was dated 36 years ago, and it made me catch my breath. Thomas, what happened between us can never happen again. You have a family responsibilities. But I want you to know that I do not regret it. I will carry this secret with me always. I did not understand what she meant, but I filed the question away for later. The third section contained legal documents. I recognised the format immediately in my years in finance, having made me familiar with the corporate paperwork. It was a share transfer agreement executed 13 years ago, transferring 20% of Banks Enterprises stock from Thomas Banks to Victoria Banks. My name, my shares. I had owned a fifth of the family company for over a decade without knowing it. I sat back trying to process what this meant. With the 70% promised in the new will, I would control 90% of Banks Enterprises. The family business would be almost entirely mine. No wonder Thomas had been so confident at that dinner. He had been building this for years. But there was one more document at the bottom of the box, and when I pulled it out, everything else faded into insignificance. It was an official form printed on state government letterhead, an adoption dissolution application. The language was cold and bureaucratic, requesting the termination of parental rights and the return of a minor child to state custody. The child's name was Victoria Banks. The date was 28 years ago when I was 7 years old. And at the bottom, in a space-marked petitioner signature, was a name written in familiar handwriting. Celia Banks. I stared at that signature for what felt like hours. 28 years ago, just 2 years after I had arrived in this house, Celia had tried to send me back. She had filled out the paperwork to return me to the orphanage like a defective purchase, an unwanted gift she had never asked for. Below the document, in my grandfather's handwriting, was a note. I stopped this. It will never happen. I swear on Margaret's memory I will protect this child. Tears streamed down my face, but I was not crying from sadness. I was crying from rage. 30 years I had lived in this house trying to earn Celia's love, trying to prove I was worthy of being part of this family. And all along, she had wanted to throw me away like garbage. She had only kept me because Thomas forced her to. I gathered the documents and placed them carefully back in the box. My hands, which had been trembling moments ago, were steady now. Something had crystallized inside me, a resolve that had been forming since that dinner, and now hardened into steel. The time for silence was over. The time for being the invisible daughter, the grateful orphan, the quiet victim was finished. Celia had tried to abandon me when I was a helpless child. She would not find me so easy to dispose of now. But one question burned in my mind above all others. What exactly had Celia tried to do to that scared little 7-year-old girl I drove home from the mansion in a daze, the wooden box sitting on the passenger seat beside me like a bomb waiting to explode? The documents inside had shattered everything I thought I knew about my place in the Banks family. But I needed more. I needed to understand the full picture before I decided what to do next. It was nearly 3 a.m. when I finally picked up my phone and dialed Eleanor Whitfield's number. I knew it was an unreasonable hour to call anyone, let alone a 72-year-old woman. But Eleanor had always told me to reach out whenever I needed her day or night. Tonight, I needed her more than ever. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice alert despite the hour. "Victoria, what is wrong?" "I found the box unheard, I said. "The wooden box Thomas told me about. I found everything." A long pause stretched across the line. I could hear Eleanor breathing, could almost feel her deciding how much to reveal. "The adoption papers," she finally said. It was not a question. "You knew." Another pause even longer than the first. Then Eleanor sighed, a sound heavy with decades of secrets. "I knew. Thomas called me that night 28 years ago. He was crying, Victoria. In 40 years of friendship, I had never seen that man shed a single tear, but that night he wept like a child." I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles white. "Tell me everything. I need to know what really happened." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more careful. "When you were 7 years old, Thomas began talking about changing his will. He wanted to include you to make sure you would be provided for regardless of what happened. He did not tell anyone except me, but somehow Celia found out." "How?" "I never learned for certain. Perhaps she overheard a conversation or found a draft document. It does not matter. What matters is that she discovered Thomas intended to leave a significant portion of his estate to the adopted child she had never wanted in her home." I closed my eyes, remembering myself at 7. Small, quiet, desperate to please, always staying out of the way, always following the rules, and always hoping that if I was good enough, they might learn to love me. "Celia was furious," Eleanor continued. "She saw you as a threat to Mark's inheritance, to her own position in the family. She decided you had to go. She told David that keeping you was destroying their family, that Mark was suffering from having to share attention with an outsider. She demanded that he sign papers to dissolve the adoption and return you to state custody." "But David refused." "Yes, it was the only time in their marriage that David ever stood against her. He told Celia that sending you back would be wrong, that you were just a child who had already lost everything. He refused to sign." I felt something shift in my chest at those words. All these years, I had seen David as weak, passive complicit in Celia's cruelty. But 28 years ago, when it mattered most, he had fought for me. "Celia did not give up," Eleanor said. "She prepared the dissolution papers herself, planning to forge David's signature. She was going to file them without his knowledge, present it as a mutual decision, and have you removed before anyone could object. But Thomas stopped her. Thomas discovered what she was planning. I do not know how. He has always had ways of learning things people wanted to keep hidden." Eleanor paused. "He confronted Celia directly. I was not there, but Thomas told me about it afterward. He said he had never been so angry in his entire life." "What did he say to her?" "He gave her an ultimatum." He told Celia that if you left that house for any reason, she and Mark would not receive a single penny of the bank's fortune. Not 1 cent. He would donate everything to charity before he would let her throw away the daughter of the woman who had saved his life. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. Thomas had protected me. He had stood between me and abandonment, using the only weapon Celia could not fight against: money. Celia backed down, Eleanor continued. She had no choice, but her hatred for you never faded. If anything, it grew stronger. Every time Thomas showed you affection, every time he included you in family activities, she saw it as a reminder of her defeat. She could not send you away, so she made your life miserable instead. The tears came, then sliding down my cheeks in the darkness of my apartment. 28 years of coldness, of cruelty, of being treated like an unwanted burden. And all of it because Celia could not forgive a 7-year-old child for being loved. You were never at fault, Victoria. Eleanor's voice was gentle, now filled with warmth. You were an innocent child caught in the middle of adult wars. You did nothing wrong. You were simply trying to survive in a house that should have been your home but never truly was. Why did no one ever tell me? Thomas wanted to protect you. He thought knowing the truth would only cause you more pain. He believed that, as long as he was alive, he could shield you from the worst of Celia's hatred. Eleanor paused. But you are not a child anymore. You are a grown woman who has built her own life, her own success. You have the right to know the truth, and you have the right to claim what is fairly yours. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. What should I do? That is not for me to decide. But I will tell you this. You have spent 30 years being silent, being invisible, being the good girl who never caused trouble. That silence has not protected you. It has only made you an easier target. Eleanor's voice grew firmer. You have power now, Victoria. Knowledge is power. Evidence is power. The question is whether you are ready to use it. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat alone in the darkness, staring at the wooden box that contained 30 years of secrets. I had decisions to make, difficult decisions that would change everything. How would I use what I now knew? And was I ready for the war that was coming? While I spent those dark hours wrestling with the weight of what I had learned, my enemies were not sitting idle. Mark had been waiting for 2 weeks, checking his mail, obsessively jumping every time his phone buzzed. When the thick envelope from Henry Foster finally arrived at his office, he locked his door and tore it open with trembling hands. I would learn the details of this later pieced together from fragments of conversation and documents that surfaced during the confrontation to come. But the picture that emerged was clear enough. Mark spread the contents of the dossier across his desk, his eyes scanning each page with growing disbelief. Reynolds Financial Consulting, founded 8 years ago, currently employing 12 people in a sleek office space in Lower Manhattan. Annual revenue of just over $2 million. A client list that included several respected startups and small businesses. And at the centre of it all, listed as managing director, was V. Reynolds, Victoria Reynolds, my mother's maiden name, my secret identity. Mark leaned back in his chair, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. She has been playing poor this whole time, he muttered to himself. The sad little orphan in her cheap clothes and her tiny apartment. And she is running a company worth millions. He flipped through more pages. Bank records, tax filings, business registrations. Everything was legitimate. Everything was legal. I had built my company properly, following every rule and regulation. There was nothing here that could be used against me in a court of law. But Mark was not looking for legal ammunition. He was looking for something he could twist, something he could use to turn the family against me. And buried deep in the dossier, he found exactly what he needed. 5 years ago, Reynolds Financial Consulting had taken on a client called Meridian Tech Solutions. It was a small, contract routine consulting work on their financial projections. I had not thought twice about it at the time. But Meridian Tech Solutions, as it turned out, was a direct competitor of Banks Enterprises in the emerging technology sector. The contract was completely legal. I had never accessed any insider information about Banks Enterprises. I had never shared anything confidential. The two engagements had no overlap whatsoever. Any objective observer would see immediately that there was no conflict of interest. But Mark did not need an objective observer. He needed a story, a narrative that would make me look like a traitor. And this was perfect. The adopted daughter, secretly wealthy, secretly running her own company, had been working with the enemy while pretending to be a loyal member of the Banks family. It did not matter that the accusation would not hold up to scrutiny. It only needed to create doubt, to poison the well, to give Celia and others a reason to question whether Thomas had been manipulated. Mark picked up his phone and dialed his mother's number. Celia answered immediately, her voice tight with the stress of the past weeks. "I have something," Mark said, unable to keep the triumph from his voice. I have something that will destroy her. Call a family meeting." "What did you find?" "She has been lying to all of us. She owns a company, a real company with millions in revenue. And 5 years ago, she worked for one of our competitors. We can use this. We can prove she has been betraying the family all along." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, Celia's voice came back cold and sharp as a blade. "When can you present this? Give me 2 days to organise everything. Then we hit her with it in front of everyone, including Thomas. Let him see the kind of person he has been protecting all these years." What neither of them knew was that they were not the only ones watching. David had been quietly monitoring the company finances for years, ever since he retired as CFO. Old habits die hard, and he had never quite been able to let go of his responsibility for the family business. He had seen the irregularities in Mark's accounts, the suspicious transfers of money that kept disappearing into offshore holding companies. He had kept his own records waiting for the right moment. That moment was approaching faster than anyone realised. 3 days after Mark received his dossier, Thomas was released from the hospital. He was weaker than before, his left side still showing traces of the stroke's damage. The doctors had warned him to rest, to avoid stress, to take things slowly. But Thomas Banks had never been a man who followed orders. He summoned me to his house the afternoon he returned home. I found him in his study, sitting in his familiar leather chair, looking diminished but determined. His eyes brightened when I walked in, and he gestured for me to close the door. "Did you find the box, Saul?" he asked without preamble. "Yes." "Did you open it?" "Yes." I sat down across from him, studying his face. "I know about Mark. The embezzlement, the offshore accounts, everything you documented." Thomas nodded slowly. 5 years of theft, $1.8 million taken from a company he was supposed to be protecting. "And I know about Celia." My voice caught slightly. "The adoption papers, what she tried to do when I was 7. Pain flickered across his face. "I never wanted you to know that. I wanted to spare you that hurt. I am glad I know." I reached out and took his hand. "I understand now why you have always protected me, and I understand what I am up against." Thomas squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "Victoria, listen to me carefully. I do not want revenge. Revenge is poison. It destroys the person who seeks it as surely as the person it targets." His eyes held mine. "What I want is for you to protect what is right. The company, the legacy, the truth about your mother. There is a difference between revenge and justice." "I understand. Mark is planning something. I can feel it. He and Celia have been whispering together, scheming. They think I am too weak to notice, but I see everything." He leaned forward. "A family meeting has been called for this weekend. They intend to ambush you." "Let them try." A small smile crossed Thomas's weathered face. "That is Margaret's daughter talking." The family meeting was coming. Mark thought he held the winning cards, but he had no idea what was waiting for him. Who truly held the power in this war? We were about to find out. The day of the family meeting arrived with weather that seemed designed by fate itself. Dark clouds rolled across the sky from early morning, and by afternoon, thunder rumbled in the distance like a warning. By the time I pulled into the driveway of Thomas's mansion, rain was lashing against the windshield so hard I could barely see the road ahead. I sat in my car for a moment watching lightning flash across the sky, gathering my thoughts. I knew what was coming. Thomas had warned me that Mark and Celia were planning an ambush. They thought they had found my weakness, my secret, the weapon that would destroy me in front of the entire family. What they did not know was that I had weapons of my own. The house blazed with light against the stormy darkness. I ran through the rain to the front door, my coat pulled over my head, and stepped inside to find the battlefield already prepared. The formal living room had been arranged for confrontation chairs positioned facing each other across the antique coffee table. A projector screen had been set up against one wall, connected to a laptop that sat ready on a side table. Mark's doing, no doubt. He was already there when I arrived, standing by the window with a glass of whiskey in his hand. His face wore an expression of barely contained anticipation, the look of a predator waiting to spring. When he saw me, his lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. Celia sat in the most prominent chair, her posture rigid, her eyes cold. She was dressed in severe black, as if attending a funeral. Perhaps she was. Perhaps she thought this would be the death of my hopes, the final proof that I did not belong. Stephanie had positioned herself near the door, looking uncomfortable, clearly wishing she were anywhere else. David sat apart from his wife, his face unreadable, his hands folded in his lap. And there was Thomas in his wheelchair, now still weak from the stroke, but insisting on being present. A nurse stood nearby, ready to intervene if needed. His eyes found mine as I entered, and he gave me the smallest nod. Be ready. Now that everyone is here, Celia announced, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Perhaps we can begin. Mark has information that the family needs to hear. Mark set down his whiskey and crossed to the laptop with theatrical confidence. Before we discuss grandfather's will, I think everyone deserves to know the truth about our dear sister Victoria. He tapped a key and the projector hummed to life. An image appeared on the screen, the logo of Reynolds Financial Consulting. Does anyone recognize this company? Mark asked, playing to his audience. No, let me enlighten you. Reynolds Financial Consulting is a boutique investment firm based in Manhattan. 12 employees, $2 million in annual revenue, a client list that includes several prominent businesses. He paused for effect. And it is owned by Victoria. Celia gasped with practiced surprise, as if she had not been briefed on every detail beforehand. Stephanie looked genuinely confused. David remained motionless. Victoria Banks, Mark continued, clicking through slides showing corporate filings and financial statements, has been pretending to be a struggling consultant while secretly running a company worth millions. She has lied to all of us for years, playing the role of the poor adopted daughter while building her own fortune. This is outrageous, Celia chimed in on cue. We welcomed her into our family, gave her everything, and she has been deceiving us all along. Mark clicked to a new slide. But that is not the worst of it. 5 years ago, Reynolds Financial Consulting signed a contract with Meridian Tech Solutions. Does that name ring a bell? It should. Meridian is a direct competitor of Banks Enterprises. He let that sink in, watching faces around the room. Our adopted sister has been working with our enemies. While we trusted her while grandfather planned to leave her the majority of our family fortune, she was secretly helping the competition. Celia leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with triumph. This is proof that she cannot be trusted. Father Thomas, I know you have a soft spot for this girl, but the evidence is clear. She has manipulated you, deceived all of us. Whatever you thought you knew about Victoria, you were wrong. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Thomas, waiting for his response. My grandfather opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say a word, another voice cut through the tension. "That is enough." Everyone turned. David was rising from his chair slowly, as if the movement required enormous effort. His face had changed. The passive, defeated expression I had known for 30 years was gone, replaced by something harder, something determined. "David, sit down," Celia snapped. "This does not concern you." "It concerns me more than you know." David's voice was shaking, but not from weakness, from barely contained emotion. "Mark, you want to talk about honesty, about betrayal, about family members who deceive each other." Mark's confident smile flickered. "Father, what are you doing?" "I am doing something I should have done years ago." David turned to face his son directly. "If we are going to discuss secrets and lies, then let us start with a real one. Explain to everyone in this room where the $1.8 million missing from Banks Enterprises accounts over the past 5 years went." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mark went pale, his glass nearly slipping from his fingers. Celia whipped around to stare at her husband, her face a mask of shock and fury. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "I am talking about embezzlement." David's voice grew stronger with each word. "I am talking about fake consulting fees, inflated expense reports, money siphoned into offshore accounts. I am talking about our son stealing from the company he was supposed to protect." Mark took a step backward, nearly stumbling over a chair. "You knew." His voice was barely a whisper. "All this time you knew." David looked at his son with an expression I could not quite read. Pain, certainly. Disappointment. But also something like resolve. Why had he stayed silent for so long? And what had finally made him speak? The meeting exploded after David's accusation. Mark sputtered denials that convinced no one. Celia screamed at her husband, demanding to know how he could betray his own son. Stephanie fled the room in tears, unable to process what she was hearing about the man she had married. Through it all, Thomas sat in his wheelchair with an expression of grim satisfaction, watching his carefully laid plans unfold. Eventually, the chaos subsided. Mark stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. Celia followed, pausing only to hiss at David that he would regret this for the rest of his life. Stephanie had already gone driving off into the storm without waiting for her husband. Only Thomas, David, and I remained in the wreckage of what had been a family meeting. Thomas excused himself, claiming exhaustion, though I suspected he simply wanted to give David and me privacy. His nurse wheeled him toward the elevator, and he caught my eye as he passed. "Listen to what he has to say," he murmured. "He has earned that much." Then we were alone, David and I, in my grandfather's study. The storm still raged outside, rain hammering against the windows, lightning illuminating the room in brief flashes. David stood by the fireplace, his back to me, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. "I suppose you have questions," he said finally, his voice tired. "Many." He turned to face me, and I saw something I had never seen before, in this man who had been my adoptive father for 30 years. I saw honesty, raw, painful honesty that had been buried for far too long. When Celia and I married, he began lowering himself into a chair across from me. I loved her, truly loved her. She was beautiful, ambitious, full of life. I thought we would build something wonderful together. He paused, staring at his hands. But over the years, I realized that she loved other things more than she loved me. Money, status, the bank's name and everything it represented. I was just the vehicle that gave her access to those things. I said nothing, letting him find his own way through the story. "When my father brought you home, I saw something in you that I recognized. A lonely child desperate for love, trying to earn acceptance from people who could not give it." His voice cracked slightly. "I saw myself, Victoria. I saw the boy I had been before I learned to stop hoping." "Why did you never say anything?" Why did you let Celia treat me the way she did? David closed his eyes, pain written across every line of his face. Because I was a coward. Because standing up to Celia meant risking everything. My marriage, my son, my place in this family. I told myself I was keeping the peace, protecting everyone by not making waves. But the truth is, I was just afraid. He opened his eyes and looked directly at me. I retired as CFO 8 years ago, but I never stopped watching the company. Old habits, I suppose. I kept reviewing the quarterly reports, comparing numbers, looking for patterns. 3 years ago, I noticed irregularities. Small things at first easily explained away, but the pattern kept growing. Mark's embezzlement, David nodded. I tracked every transaction. I built a complete record of what he had taken and where it went. $1.8 million over 5 years funneled into offshore accounts hidden behind fake consulting contracts. He laughed bitterly. My own son stealing from the company my father built with his bare hands. Why did you not tell anyone? Because I was still afraid. Afraid of what would happen if I exposed him. Afraid of Celia's reaction. Afraid of destroying what little was left of my family. Tears began to form in his eyes. I kept telling myself I was waiting for the right moment, but there is never a right moment for something like this. I was just a coward hiding behind excuses. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. I kept my own records, everything documented, everything verified. When I heard what Mark was planning tonight, how he intended to destroy you with accusations of betrayal, I knew I could not stay silent any longer. David handed me the envelope. Inside were dozens of pages of financial records, transaction logs, bank statements. Combined with what Thomas had collected, it painted an undeniable picture of Mark's crimes. There is something else you should know. David continued, his voice dropping lower. Something I've never told anyone. I looked up from the documents. When you first came to live with us, I tried to help you in small ways. I paid for tutoring sessions that Celia never approved. Math, reading, piano lessons. She thought the money was going to Mark's activities. It was going to you. I remembered those lessons. A kind tutor who came to the house twice a week. I had always assumed it was arranged by the school or by Thomas. And the letters, David said. Your first few years with us, you used to receive cards and letters, birthday wishes, holiday greetings. They were from people at the orphanage who remembered you foster families you had stayed with briefly. Celia threw them away, every single one, but I saved as many as I could before she found them. He reached into another pocket and withdrew a small bundle of envelopes, yellowed with age, tied with a simple string. I have been keeping them all these years, waiting for the right time to give them to you. I took the letters with trembling hands. Pieces of my childhood, pieces of connection that Celia had tried to erase. And the adoption papers, I said quietly. You refused to sign them. David's face crumpled. That was the one time I found real courage. Celia was determined to send you back, and she needed my signature to make it happen. I looked at that document and I thought about you. 7 years old, finally starting to feel safe, finally starting to trust. And I could not do it. I could not sign away your chance at a family, even a broken one like ours. Tears were streaming freely down his face now. You are the only person in this family I am proud of, Victoria. You survived everything we put you through and you became something good. Something real. He reached out and took my hand. I should have protected you more. I should have stood up sooner. I am so sorry. I squeezed his hand, feeling something shift between us. 30 years of distance, of silence, of missed connections. And, now finally, honesty. Did David's evidence combined with Thomas's records give me enough to bring Mark to justice? The answer seemed clear. But what would I choose to do with that power? The morning after the confrontation, I sat in the offices of Wells and Associates, a boutique law firm on the 32nd floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan. The reception area was elegant, but understated leather chairs and mahogany tables, the kind of place where old money came to handle its most delicate affairs. Catherine Wells emerged from her office to greet me personally. She was 60 years old, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. I knew her reputation well. She was one of the most respected estate attorneys in New York, known for her integrity and her discretion. What I had not known until recently was that she had history with my family. "Victoria," she said warmly, taking my hand in both of hers, "I have been waiting a long time to meet you properly. Your grandfather speaks of you constantly." "You knew my mother," I said. It was not a question. Catherine's expression softened. "I worked with Margaret on your grandfather's case 38 years ago. I was just a junior associate then, barely out of law school. She was brilliant, Victoria, absolutely brilliant, and fearless in a way that I have rarely seen since." She led me into her office and closed the door. The room was lined with books and framed certificates, but what caught my attention was a photograph on her desk. A young woman with dark hair and determined eyes standing in front of a courthouse smiling at the camera. My mother. I had never seen this picture before. "Thomas gave me that," Catherine said, following my gaze. "He thought I should have a reminder of what real courage looks like." She sat down behind her desk and gestured for me to take the chair opposite. "Now, let us discuss what you have brought me." I handed her the combined evidence. Thomas's records from the wooden box, David's documentation of transactions, financial statements, bank records, routing numbers. Catherine spread the papers across her desk and began to review them with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades analysing complex cases. 20 minutes passed in silence. I watched her face for any reaction, but she remained impassive, a professional mask that revealed nothing. Finally, she set down the last document and looked up at me. "You have more than enough for criminal prosecution," she said. "Embezzlement over $1 million is a Class B felony in New York. Given the amount involved and the duration of the scheme, Mark could face 5 to 8 years in prison." I had known this was coming, but hearing it stated so plainly still hit me hard. 5 to 8 years. My adoptive brother, the man who had tormented me since childhood, could spend nearly a decade behind bars. "Additionally," Catherine continued, "there is potential for civil recovery. The company could sue Mark personally for the full amount plus damages. His assets would be seized, his professional reputation destroyed. He would never work in finance again." I thought about Thomas's words from the night before. "I do not want revenge, child. I want you to protect what is right. There is a difference." I thought about Mark at the dinner smirking as he projected my secrets onto the screen. I thought about 30 years of insults, of being called a stray, of being treated like garbage in my own home. Then I thought about something else. Mark had 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 5. I had met them only a handful of times, always briefly, always with Celia, hovering nearby to ensure minimal contact. But I remembered their faces, innocent faces untouched by the ugliness of adult conflicts. What would happen to them if their father went to prison? What would they learn about family, about trust, about the world, if their earliest memories were of visiting their father behind bars? "I want fairness," I said slowly, the words forming as I spoke them. "Not destruction." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Could you elaborate?" "Mark has children, young children who have done nothing wrong. If I send their father to prison, those kids will pay the price for his crimes. They will grow up marked by shame, visiting their father in an orange jumpsuit, trying to explain to their classmates why daddy is not at home." I shook my head. "I will not be the one to do that to them. So you want to let him go free?" "No, I want justice, just not the kind that destroys innocent people along the way." I leaned forward. "Here is what I propose. Mark must repay every dollar he stole, $1.8 million, within 18 months. He must resign as CFO immediately and permanently, and he must sign a written admission of his crimes to be presented to the board of directors. Catherine was making notes. What about criminal charges? If he agrees to these terms and follows through completely, I will not pursue prosecution. The matter stays private, handled within the family. I paused, feeling my voice harden. But if he refuses, or if he tries to fight back, or if he violates any part of the agreement, I will show him no mercy. Every document we have goes to the district attorney. Every transaction, every account, every bit of evidence. He will face the full consequences of what he has done. Catherine studied me for a long moment. Then a small smile crossed her face. You are your mother's daughter, she said. Margaret was the same way, still wrapped in compassion. She believed in justice, but she never forgot that justice is meant to heal, not just to punish. Will you draw up the agreement? I will have it ready by tomorrow morning. Catherine gathered the documents and placed them carefully in a folder. But, Victoria, I must ask, what if Mark refuses? What if his pride will not let him accept terms from the sister he has spent his whole life looking down on? I stood smoothing my coat. Then he will learn that the stray he brought home has teeth, and I am not afraid to use them. Catherine nodded approvingly. I will call you when the documents are ready. And, Victoria, she waited until I met her eyes. Your mother would be proud of you. I am certain of it. I left the office with the weight of decision settling on my shoulders. The terms were fair. More than fair, really. I was offering Mark a chance to make things right, to avoid prison, to preserve his relationship with his children. Any reasonable person would accept. But Mark had never been reasonable when it came to me. His hatred ran too deep, his pride too strong. Would he swallow that pride and accept my terms, or would he gamble everything on one final attempt to destroy me? The text message arrived 3 days after my meeting with Catherine Wells. I was at my office reviewing contracts when my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognise. The message was brief. Victoria, I need to speak with you. Please, Celia. I stared at the screen for a long moment. In 30 years, Celia had never once asked me for anything. She had demanded, commanded, criticised and dismissed. But she had never said please. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from the Upper East Side circles where she might be recognised. I chose a place I knew well, a quiet corner establishment, where I had spent many hours working on business plans and financial projections. Neutral territory on my terms. I arrived early and claimed a table near the back facing the door. When Celia walked in, I almost did not recognise her. The woman who entered the coffee shop bore little resemblance to the polished socialite who had ruled the Banks household with an iron fist. She wore no makeup or very little. Her hair, usually perfectly styled, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her clothes were plain, almost dowdy. Designer labels replaced by ordinary department store basics. But it was her face that shocked me most. The sharp edges had crumbled. The imperious expression that had frozen me in place countless times throughout my childhood was gone. In its place was something I had never seen on Celia Banks. Defeat. She looked 10 years older than she had at the family meeting just weeks ago. Celia spotted me and made her way to the table. She did not sit immediately standing awkwardly, as if waiting for permission. I gestured to the chair across from me and she lowered herself into it with the careful movements of someone whose body had forgotten how to relax. Thank you for coming, she said. Her voice was hoarse, roughened by what I imagined had been days of crying, arguing, not sleeping. I said nothing. I was not going to make this easy for her. I am not here to beg for myself. Celia met my eyes briefly before looking away. I know you have no reason to help me. After everything I have done, everything I have said, I have no right to ask you for anything. Then, why are you here? Because of Mark. Her voice cracked on her son's name. I am here because of my son. I waited, letting the silence stretch. You do not know him, Celia continued. Not really. You know the man he became, but you never knew the boy he was. Mark was a good child once, Victoria. Sweet, eager to please, always trying to earn approval. Especially from Thomas. She paused to take a breath, steadying herself. From the day he was born, Mark worshipped his grandfather. He wanted so desperately to make Thomas proud, to be seen as worthy of the bank's name. He studied hard, joined every activity. Thomas valued, shaped his entire life around becoming the kind of man he thought his grandfather wanted him to be. And then I came along. Celia nodded slowly. And then you came along. A 5-year-old girl with nothing, and suddenly Thomas had eyes for no one else. Mark would bring home perfect grades, and Thomas would say, "That is nice," before turning back to you. Mark would win awards, achieve milestones, and Thomas would give him a distracted pat on the head while asking if you needed anything. I remembered those years differently. I remembered being invisible, unwanted, barely tolerated. But I stayed silent, letting Celia continue. Mark tried harder. He always tried harder. He went to the best schools, got the best degrees, joined the family company, and worked his way up to CFO. Everything he did was to prove himself to Thomas. Celia's hands were shaking now. And none of it mattered, because Thomas had already decided that you were the one who deserved his love, his attention, his legacy. That was not my choice, I said quietly. I never asked for any of it. I know. Celia's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I know that now. But Mark did not see it that way. He saw a stranger being given everything he had spent his life trying to earn. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. 13 years ago, when Mark discovered that Thomas had secretly transferred company shares to you, he came to me in the middle of the night. He was shaking, crying like he had not cried since he was a child. He kept saying the same thing over and over. Why does grandfather hate me? What did I do wrong? Why am I never enough? I felt something shift in my chest. Not sympathy exactly, but understanding. I had spent 30 years wondering why this family could not love me. I had never considered that Mark might have spent those same years wondering why his grandfather seemed to love someone else more. That was when things started to change, Celia continued. Mark became bitter, angry. He stopped trying to earn Thomas's approval and started believing he deserved to take what would not be given. The embezzlement began not long after. She wiped her eyes with a napkin. I do not excuse what he did. I know it was wrong. But I'm asking you, Victoria, as a mother who loves her son despite all his failures, please do not destroy his life. I studied the woman sitting across from me. For 30 years, she had been my tormentor, the cold voice that reminded me I did not belong, the sneering presence that made me feel worthless in my own home. I had every reason to hate her, but looking at her now, I did not see a monster. I saw a desperate mother who had made terrible choices and was watching her family crumble because of them. I have already offered Mark terms, I said finally. Repayment, resignation, admission. If he accepts, there will be no prosecution. Hope flickered in Celia's eyes. He will accept. I will make sure of it. But there is something I need from you. I leaned forward. I will give Mark one chance. One. But before I do, you must tell me the truth. All of it. Celia went still. Why do you hate me so much, Celia? What did a 5-year-old child ever do to deserve 30 years of cruelty? The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged. Then Celia closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, I saw something break behind them. The last wall, the final defense. What was she about to confess? Celia did not speak immediately. She sat there across from me, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she had not touched, her eyes fixed on some point beyond my shoulder. I could see her gathering herself, preparing to reveal something she had kept buried for decades. 38 years ago. She finally began, her voice barely above a whisper, when Margaret saved Thomas from prison. Everything changed in the Banks family. Thomas could not stop talking about her. At dinner, at family gatherings, in quiet moments, when he thought no one was listening. Margaret, this, Margaret, that. Margaret is brilliant. Margaret is brave. Without Margaret, we would have nothing. She paused, her jaw tightening. I was a new bride then. David and I had been married less than 2 years. I was trying so hard to find my place in this family, to prove myself worthy of the Banks name. And suddenly, there was this woman, this stranger, who had done something so extraordinary that nothing I did could ever compare. I listened in silence, watching the emotions play across her face. Pain, resentment, and something else. Something that looked almost like shame. Thomas spoke about Margaret with a light in his eyes that I had never seen before. Celia continued. Not when he looked at David, not when he looked at me, not when he looked at anyone in the family. She was his hero, his saviour, the most remarkable person he had ever known. Her voice grew bitter. I was just the daughter-in-law, the woman who had married his son, nobody special, nobody important. You were jealous, I said, of a woman you had never met. Celia laughed, but there was no humour in it. Jealous is too small a word. I was consumed by it. I hated Margaret Reynolds with every fibre of my being. I hated her brilliance, her courage, her hold on my father-in-law's heart. I lay awake at night imagining ways to diminish her in Thomas's eyes, to make him see that she was not as perfect as he believed. She finally looked directly at me. But I never got the chance. Margaret died before I could ever meet her. And I thought, finally it would be over. Thomas would grieve for a while and then he would move on. Her shadow would fade and I could step into the light. But that is not what happened. No, Celia's voice cracked. Instead, Thomas brought home a 5-year-old girl, Margaret's daughter, a living, breathing reminder of the woman he could not stop loving. The pieces were falling into place now. 30 years of cruelty, 30 years of being treated like an unwanted burden, and it all came back to this. A jealousy that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with a ghost. When I first saw you, Celia said, her hands trembling around the coffee cup, I felt like I had been punched in the chest. You looked so much like her. Thomas had a photograph of Margaret in his study, and when you walked through our door, it was like seeing that photograph come to life. The same eyes, the same expression, the same quiet determination. I was 5 years old, I said quietly. I did not even know who Margaret was. I know. Tears began to stream down Celia's face. I know that now, and I knew it then, but I could not stop myself. Every time Thomas looked at you with that light in his eyes, I saw Margaret. Every time he praised you, held you, showed you the affection he never showed anyone else, I felt like I was losing to a dead woman all over again. She reached for a napkin and pressed it to her eyes. The worst part is that you never fought back. You just endured it. Day after day, year after year, you absorbed every cruel word, every cold shoulder, every reminder that you did not belong. And your silence only made it worse. It made you more like her. Margaret had that same quality, that ability to stand strong in the face of opposition without ever losing her dignity. So you punished me for being like my mother. Yes. The word came out as a sob. I punished an innocent child for the crime of reminding me of someone I hated, someone I had never even met. Celia's whole body was shaking now. I tried to send you back to the orphanage because I could not stand having you in my house. I made your life miserable because every time I looked at you, I saw my own inadequacy reflected back at me. I sat in silence, letting her words sink in. 30 years of pain, 30 years of wondering what I had done wrong, and the answer was nothing. I had done nothing. I was simply the wrong person's daughter, the living reminder of a woman who had overshadowed Celia before I was even born. "I know it was wrong," Celia whispered. "I know there is no excuse for what I did. You were a child who had lost everything, and instead of giving you love, I gave you cruelty. I turned my own pain into your punishment." She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "I am not asking you to forgive me. I do not deserve forgiveness. I am just asking you to understand that my hatred was never really about you. It was about her. It was always about her." The silence stretched between us, heavy with decades of unspoken hurt. I thought about the little girl I'd been, so desperate for love, so willing to believe that if she just tried hard enough, she could earn a place in this family. I thought about all the nights I had cried myself to sleep, wondering what was wrong with me, why I was so unlovable. And now I knew. There was nothing wrong with me. There never had been. "I am not Margaret," I said finally, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. "I never was. I am Victoria. A separate person with my own life, my own dreams, my own worth. I spent 30 years trying to earn your love without knowing that you were fighting a ghost that had nothing to do with me." Celia nodded, tears still streaming down her face. "I will not destroy Mark. I continued, standing up from the table. "I offered him terms, and if he accepts them, I will honour my word. Your son will have a chance to make things right." Relief flooded Celia's features. Thank you, Victoria." "But do not expect forgiveness from me," I said, looking down at her. "Not today, maybe not ever. You stole 30 years of my life, 30 years of feeling worthless, of believing I was unlovable, of carrying wounds that may never fully heal. I cannot simply let that go because you finally told me the truth." Celia nodded again, accepting the judgment. "I understand." "I hope someday you find peace with whatever drove you to do the things you did," I said. "But that peace will not come from me. It has to come from within yourself." I turned and walked toward the door, leaving Celia sitting alone at the table. At the threshold, I paused and looked back. "Goodbye, Celia." She did not respond. She simply sat there, broken, watching me go. Would I ever be able to forgive her? Would the wounds of 30 years ever truly heal? I drove to Thomas's house the day after my meeting with Celia. The weight of everything I had learned pressed down on me, and I needed guidance from the one person who had always been my anchor in the storm of this family. The house was quiet when I arrived. The usual bustle of staff had been replaced by a more sombre atmosphere. Thomas had been declining steadily since his stroke, and now he spent most of his time in the bedroom that had been converted into a medical suite. Nurses came and went at all hours, monitoring his vital signs, administering medications, keeping him comfortable. I found him propped up on pillows, looking out the window at the garden he had tended for decades. He was thinner than I remembered, his cheeks hollow, his skin papery and pale. But when he saw me enter, his eyes lit up with the same warmth they had shown since the day he first knelt down to meet my gaze 30 years ago. "Victoria." His voice was weaker now, but still clear. "Come sit with me." I pulled a chair close to his bedside and took his hand. His fingers were cold, but his grip was surprisingly firm. "How are you feeling?" I asked. "Old," he said with a faint smile. "Tired. Ready for whatever comes next." He studied my face with those keen eyes that seemed to see everything. "But you did not come here to ask about my health. Something is troubling you." I should have known better than to try to hide anything from him. Thomas had always been able to read me like a book. "I met with Celia yesterday," I said. "She told me things about why she has hated me all these years." Thomas nodded slowly. "Margaret." "You knew?" "I suspected." He sighed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. Celia's jealousy was never subtle, even if she thought she was hiding it. I saw the way she looked at you, especially when I showed you affection. I understood what was driving it, even if I never confronted her directly about it. I hesitated before asking my next question. Grandfather, may I ask you something? Anything, child. Did you ever hate Celia for everything she did to me, everything she put me through? Did you hate her for it? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting back to the window. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, measured. I was furious once. When I discovered she had tried to send you back to the orphanage, I wanted to throw her out of this house and never let her return. The rage I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had experienced before. But you did not act on it. No, he turned back to me. Over time, I came to understand something about Celia. She is a product of her era, Victoria. She grew up in a world that taught women their worth came from the men they married and the social positions they held. She was never taught how to love unconditionally. She was never shown that affection did not have to be earned or competed for. That does not excuse what she did. No, it does not. Thomas squeezed my hand gently. Understanding is not the same as excusing. I understand why Celia became the person she is. I understand the insecurities and fears that drove her cruelty. But understanding does not erase the harm she caused. It simply helps me see her as a complete person rather than a monster. I thought about this. Celia sitting across from me in the coffee shop, broken and desperate. Celia as a young bride, feeling invisible in the shadow of a woman she had never met. Celia making terrible choices out of jealousy and fear, hurting an innocent child because she did not know how to deal with her own pain. How do you forgive someone who has hurt you so deeply? I asked. Is it even possible? Thomas smiled weakly. Forgiveness is not what most people think it is. It does not mean forgetting what was done. It does not mean pretending the hurt never happened. And it certainly does not mean allowing the person to continue hurting you. He paused, gathering his strength. Forgiveness means choosing not to let anger control you. It means refusing to carry the weight of hatred everywhere you go. It is a gift you give yourself. Victoria, not a gift you give the person who wronged you. I nodded slowly, letting his words sink in. Your mother understood this, Thomas continued. Margaret had every reason to hate the men who tried to destroy me, the powerful people who threatened her and tried to ruin her career. But she never let that hatred consume her. She fought for what was right, but she did not fight out of vengeance. She fought because she believed in truth and justice. His eyes met mine with an intensity that seemed to cut through his physical weakness. Whatever you decide about this family is your right. You have the power now to punish those who hurt you, to take revenge for 30 years of cruelty. No one could blame you if you did. But you do not want me to. I want you to remember what your mother taught me. Thomas's voice grew softer. She did not teach me revenge. She taught me to protect truth. There is a difference between justice and vengeance, Victoria. Justice restores balance. Vengeance just creates more pain. I sat with him in silence for a long while, holding his hand, watching the afternoon light move across the walls. I thought about everything that had happened since that fateful dinner. The secrets revealed, the betrayals uncovered, the truths finally spoken after decades of silence. I thought about Mark, broken by years of trying to earn love from a grandfather who seemed to give it freely to someone else. I thought about Celia, consumed by jealousy of a ghost. I thought about David finally finding the courage to speak after a lifetime of silence. And I thought about myself, the invisible daughter who had endured so much, who had built her own success in secret, who now held the power to reshape this family forever. I have made my decision, I said finally. Thomas looked at me, waiting. I am going to call a family meeting tomorrow, and this time I will be the one in control. A small smile crossed his weathered face. "That is my girl." I leaned forward and kissed his forehead. "Thank you, grandfather, for everything." As I left his room, I felt something shift inside me. The anger was still there, but it no longer controlled me. The pain was still real, but it no longer defined me. What judgment would I deliver the family would find out tomorrow? The formal dining room of the bank's mansion had never felt so charged with tension. I had chosen this space deliberately. It was the room where family decisions had been announced for generations, where power had been displayed and wielded. Today, for the first time in 30 years, I would be the one wielding it. I arrived early to arrange the room exactly as I wanted it. The long mahogany table had been cleared of its usual decorative centerpieces. In their place, I positioned folders at specific seats, each one containing documents that would shape the future of this family. Catherine Wells stood by the window, reviewing her notes, ready to provide legal guidance, if needed. Thomas was wheeled in first, his nurse positioning him near the head of the table, where he could see everyone clearly. He looked frail but alert, his eyes sharp with anticipation. He gave me a small nod of encouragement. David arrived next, looking more at peace than I had ever seen him. Our conversation after the storm meeting had changed something between us. He was no longer the passive bystander, the coward hiding behind his wife's decisions. He had found his voice, and he seemed lighter for it. Celia came through the door with the careful steps of someone walking to her own sentencing. She had made an effort to look presentable, but the polish was gone. The imperious society queen had been replaced by a woman facing the consequences of a lifetime of choices. She took her seat without meeting anyone's eyes. Mark entered last, and I could see immediately that the past weeks had taken their toll. His suit hung looser on his frame. His face was drawn dark circles under his eyes, betraying sleepless nights. Gone was the smug confidence that had defined him at that fateful dinner. In its place was barely concealed fear. But there was one more person I had not expected. Stephanie followed Mark through the door, her expression unreadable. She had asked to attend, and I had agreed. Whatever happened today would affect her and her children profoundly. She deserved to be present. Once everyone was seated, I did something I had never done before in this house. I walked to the head of the table, the position that had always belonged to Thomas, and I stood there looking out at the family that had never wanted me. The room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming." I began, my voice steady and clear. "I know the past few weeks have been difficult. Secrets have been revealed, accusations have been made, and this family has been torn apart in ways that may never fully heal." I let those words settle over the room. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Celia gripped the arms of her chair. "But I did not call this meeting to rehash the past. I called it to determine the future." I picked up the first folder and walked around the table to place it in front of Mark. He flinched as if I had struck him. I opened the folder so he could see its contents. Page after page of financial records, transaction logs, bank statements. The complete documentation of his crimes. Evidence of $1.8 million embezzled from bank's enterprises over the past 5 years. I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. Fake consulting contracts, inflated expense reports, money funneled into offshore accounts. I paused, letting the weight of each word sink in. "This is enough to send you to prison for 5 to 8 years. Mark's face drained of colour. His hands trembled as he stared at the documents, the undeniable proof of what he had done. Across the table, Stephanie was watching her husband with an expression of profound disappointment. Whatever love remained between them was being tested to its breaking point. "You could have had everything," I continued. "You were being groomed to run this company. Thomas gave you every opportunity to prove yourself, and instead of earning your place, you decided to steal it." Mark opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The confident man who had mocked me at the restaurant, who had tried to destroy me with revelations about my company, had vanished entirely. In his place was someone small and frightened, facing the ruins of his own making. I could hand this file to the district attorney today, I said. By tomorrow, you would be facing criminal charges. By next month, you would be preparing for trial. And within a year, you could be in a federal prison. Your career destroyed, your family shattered, your children growing up, visiting their father behind bars. Stephanie made a small sound, her hand flying to her mouth. I saw her look at her husband, then at me, her eyes wide with fear for her children's future. But that is not what I want. The words hung in the air. Mark looked up at me, confusion mixing with desperate hope on his face. I do not want you in prison, Mark. I do not want your children to suffer for your crimes, and I do not Hello, sure. Jag så want ända measures to spend the next several years of my life pursuing vengeance when I could be building something better. I walked back to the head of the table, positioning myself where I could see everyone clearly. Here are my terms. You will repay every dollar you stole, 1.8 million in full within 18 months. You will resign as CFO of Banks Enterprises immediately effective today, and you will write a formal letter of admission to the board of directors acknowledging your misconduct and accepting responsibility for your actions. Mark was shaking his head slowly, not in refusal, but in disbelief. You want me to admit everything in writing? Yes. My voice left no room for negotiation. The board deserves to know what happened. The company deserves to move forward with full knowledge of the past. And you deserve the chance to take responsibility for what you did, rather than having it exposed in a courtroom. I placed a second folder on the table, this one containing the agreement that Catherine Wells had prepared. If you accept these terms and fulfill them completely, I will not pursue criminal charges. The matter will be handled privately within the family and the company. Your children will not have to visit their father in prison. Mark stared at the folder as if it might bite him. But if you refuse, I continued, and now my voice hardened. Or if you accept and then fail to comply, or if you try in any way to fight back or undermine this agreement, I will show no mercy. Every document in that folder goes to the prosecutor. Every transaction, every account, every piece of evidence. And I will push for the maximum sentence the law allows. The room was absolutely silent. I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, the distant sound of traffic outside. You have 48 hours to decide. I looked directly at Mark. I suggest you use them wisely. Mark sat frozen, his eyes moving between the evidence folder and the agreement between the threat of prison and the path to salvation. Stephanie reached over and gripped his arm, her knuckles white. Would he accept the humiliation of admitting his crimes, or would his pride push him to fight a battle he could not win? The silence in the room stretched unbearably. Mark sat motionless, staring at the documents in front of him, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Pride, fear, anger, desperation. I could see him wrestling with himself, the part of him that wanted to fight, warring against the part that knew he had already lost. Before he could speak, Stephanie's voice cut through the tension. Mark. Her tone was firm, but not unkind. Do not be a fool. Think about our children. Mark turned to look at his wife. Something passed between them, a conversation without words that spoke of sleepless nights and whispered fears of a marriage strained to its breaking point by secrets finally revealed. Emma is 8 years old. Stephanie continued, her voice cracking slightly. Lucas is 5. They worship you. They think their father is a hero. If you fight this, if you go to prison, they will grow up with that shame. Every day at school, every time someone looks at them with pity, every birthday and Christmas spent visiting you behind bars. She reached out and gripped his hand. I cannot forgive what you have done. I do not know if our marriage can survive this. But please, for the sake of our children, do not make this worse than it already is." The room watched as Mark's resistance crumbled. His shoulders sagged, his head dropped, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I accept." 2 words that changed everything. 2 words that acknowledged defeat, accepted responsibility, and surrendered to consequences he could no longer escape. I nodded once, keeping my face neutral despite the emotions churning inside me. "Catherine will have the formal agreement ready for your signature tomorrow. You will tender your resignation to the board by end of business today." Mark did not respond. He simply sat there broken, staring at his hands. I turned to face Celia. "Now, you." She had been sitting rigid throughout the exchange with her, Mark watching her son's downfall with an expression of barely contained anguish. When my gaze fell on her, she braced herself, visibly gripping the arms of her chair as if preparing for a physical blow. "I have something that belongs to you," I said, pulling another folder from the stack. I opened it and held up the adoption dissolution papers, the document she had signed 28 years ago, attempting to send me back to the orphanage. Her signature was clearly visible, a permanent record of her cruelty. "Do you recognise this?" I asked. Celia's face went white, her eyes fixed on the paper with something close to horror. She had probably hoped this document had been lost or destroyed long ago. She had not counted on Thomas keeping evidence of her darkest deed. "I could make this public," I continued. "I could send copies to every charity board you sit on, every social committee where you wield influence, every friend whose respect you have cultivated over decades. I could destroy your reputation so thoroughly that you would never show your face in polite society again." Celia closed her eyes, waiting for the blow to fall. "But I will not." Her eyes flew open, confusion replacing fear. "What? I am not going to release these papers. I am not going to destroy your social standing. I am not going to publicly humiliate you the way you privately tormented me for 30 years. Celia stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Around the table, I could see similar expressions of surprise. David's eyebrows had risen nearly to his hairline. Even Thomas looked mildly startled. "My conditions are these," I said. "You will resign from all charity boards and social committees where you have wielded influence. You will not interfere in any business decisions related to banks' enterprises, and you will write me a personal letter of apology, not public, not performative, just a letter between you and me acknowledging what you did and the harm it caused." "That is all." Celia's voice was barely a whisper. "That is all." "Why?" The question seemed torn from somewhere deep inside her. "After everything I did to you, everything I put you through, why will you not destroy me? I tried to send you back to an orphanage when you were 7 years old. I made your childhood a misery. I treated you worse than I would treat a stray animal. Why would you show me any mercy at all?" I looked at the woman who had been my tormentor for 3 decades. I saw the fear in her eyes, the shame, the dawning realization that she had underestimated me in every possible way. For 30 years, she had seen me as weak, as someone to be dismissed and diminished. Now, she was seeing something different. Now, she was seeing my mother's daughter. "Because my mother spent her life protecting others," I said. "She fought for people who could not fight for themselves. She stood up against powerful forces and won through courage and integrity, not through cruelty or revenge." I paused, letting the words settle over the room. "If I become someone who destroys, someone who tears down others for the satisfaction of watching them fall, then I betray everything she stood for. I become the thing she fought against. And I will not do that. Not for you, not for anyone." Celia was crying, now silent tears streaming down her face. But these were not the manipulative tears I had seen her shed at social functions when she wanted sympathy. These were real, raw, the tears of someone confronting the full weight of their own failures. The adoption papers will go back in the safe, I continued. They will never be shown to anyone. But know this, Celia. I am keeping them, and if you, as ever try to interfere with my life again, if you attempt to undermine me or turn others against me or cause harm to anyone I care about, I will not hesitate to use them. This mercy is given once. There will not be a second chance. Celia nodded, unable to speak. I looked around the table at this family that had caused me so much pain. Mark defeated and facing the consequences of his crimes. Celia confronted with her cruelty and shown mercy she did not deserve. David finally free from his own silence. Thomas watching with quiet pride as his plans unfolded. And Stephanie caught in the middle trying to protect her children from the fallout of their father's choices. This meeting is adjourned, I said. Catherine will be in touch with each of you regarding the specific terms of your agreements. I expect full compliance. I gathered my folders and walked toward the door. At the threshold, I paused and looked back at the room. We have all made mistakes. Some of us have made terrible ones. But this family can still choose what it wants to become. I hope you choose wisely. How would the Banks family transform after this reckoning? Only time would tell. 3 months passed after the judgment, and the Banks family transformed in ways none of us could have predicted. The wheels of consequence turned slowly but inevitably, reshaping lives and revealing truths about character that had been hidden for decades. Mark signed his resignation letter the same day as the family meeting. By the following week, his office at Banks Enterprises had been cleared, his nameplate removed from the door, his parking space reassigned. The official story was that he had chosen to pursue other opportunities, but rumours spread quickly through New York's business circles. Financial irregularities, internal investigation, quiet departure under pressure. I never made official charges, never spoke to the press, never confirmed or denied anything. But word travels in these circles. It always does. Within 2 months, Mark had applied to over 40 positions at firms across the city. Not one of them called him back for an interview. His reputation, built over 15 years of climbing the corporate ladder, had been destroyed by whispers he could not fight, because the truth was worse than any rumour. The golden son of the Banks family, the heir apparent to a fortune, had become untouchable. He sold the mansion in Westchester first. The house he had been so proud of, the symbol of his success and status, went on the market at a price below its value because he needed the cash quickly. The luxury cars followed, then the vacation property in the Hamptons, then the boat he had bought but rarely used. Piece by piece, he liquidated the life he had built on stolen money. By the end of the 3rd month, Mark was living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, a far cry from the lifestyle he had known, but comfortable enough. He had begun making payments toward the $1.8 million he owed, transferring funds from the sale of his assets according to the schedule Catherine Wells had prepared. At this rate, he would fulfill his obligation within the 18-month deadline, but just barely. I kept track of his progress through Catherine's reports. I did not reach out to him directly, and he did not contact me. The terms of our agreement required compliance, not reconciliation. Stephanie filed for divorce 6 weeks after the family meeting. She had stayed long enough to ensure the children would be protected in the settlement, long enough to understand the full scope of what Mark had done and hidden from her. When she finally made her decision, she was calm and resolute. I can accept poverty, she told Mark, according to David, who had witnessed the conversation. I can accept starting over with nothing. What I cannot accept is being deceived for years by the man I trusted with my life. Mark did not fight the divorce. He had no grounds to fight it, and perhaps somewhere inside he understood that he had earned this consequence. The settlement was fair, but not generous. Stephanie would have primary custody of the children, with Mark receiving visitation on weekends and holidays. I had made certain, through Catherine, that the agreement protected his relationship with his children. Whatever Mark had done, Emma and Lucas deserved to know their father. I saw the children once, about 2 months after everything happened. They were at Thomas's house for a visit, playing in the garden, while their grandfather watched from his wheelchair. They seemed happy, oblivious to the adult dramas that had reshaped their world. I hoped they could stay that way for as long as possible. Celia's fall was perhaps the most dramatic. She had built her entire identity around her social position, her charity boards, her committees, her influence in the circles where old money gathered to congratulate itself. When she resigned from those positions as I had required, she lost more than titles. She lost the foundation of who she believed herself to be. The friends who had surrounded her for decades vanished almost overnight. Invitations stopped arriving. Phone calls went unreturned. The women who had flattered and admired her, who had competed for her attention and approval, suddenly had no time for someone who could no longer open doors or elevate their status. Celia discovered what I had always known: her relationships had been transactional, built on what she could provide rather than who she was. For the first time in her life, Celia Banks confronted genuine loneliness. The mansion felt empty without the constant stream of social obligations. The calendar that had once been packed with lunches and galas and committee meetings now stretched blank and formless. She began seeing a therapist. This was perhaps the most surprising development of all. Celia had always viewed therapy as a sign of weakness, something for people who could not handle their own problems. But faced with the ruins of her carefully constructed life, she finally sought help. I learnt this from David, who seemed cautiously optimistic about the change. David himself was the unexpected bright spot in the aftermath. Freed from the weight of secrets and the shadow of his wife's dominance, he flourished in ways none of us had anticipated. He enrolled in art classes at a community centre in the city, discovering a talent for watercolours he had never known he possessed. He started writing a memoir, not for publication, but for himself, processing decades of silence and compromise through the act of putting words on paper. Most remarkably, he began to travel. Short trips at first-day excursions to places he had always wanted to see, but had never visited. Then longer journeys a week in New England to see the fall colours, a trip to Chicago for an art exhibition, plans forming for a visit to Europe in the spring. "I have spent 30 years being afraid," he told me one afternoon when I visited Thomas. Afraid of Celia's disapproval, afraid of rocking the boat, afraid of my own shadow. And now, for the first time in my life, I feel alive. He and Celia had not divorced. They were living separately, she in the mansion and he in a small apartment downtown, but they remained legally married. Whether that would change, neither of them seemed ready to say. Perhaps they were both too exhausted from the upheaval to make any more major decisions. Through it all, I visited Thomas as often as I could. His health continued to decline, the stroke having taken a toll that no amount of medical care could fully reverse. He spent most of his days in the converted bedroom, looking out at his garden, receiving visits from the people who mattered to him. But each time I saw him, he seemed a little weaker, a little more diminished. The light in his eyes remained sharp, but his body was failing. How much longer did he have? The doctors could not say for certain. The weeks that followed the judgment were measured not in days, but in moments. Each visit to Thomas felt precious, weighted with the knowledge that our time together was running out. His health declined steadily, the damage from the stroke compounding, with the simple weariness of a body that had carried 75 years of burdens. I rearranged my schedule to spend as much time with him as possible. Reynolds Financial could run without me for a while. James and the team were more than capable. What they could not do was sit beside my grandfather and listen to the stories that only he could tell. We talked for hours sometimes about Margaret, sometimes about the early days of Banks Enterprises, sometimes about nothing at all. Thomas had lived a full life, and now, as it drew to a close, he seemed determined to pass on everything he had learned. "Your mother had a way of seeing through people," he told me one afternoon, his voice thin but clear. She could look at someone and understand their true nature in minutes. It was what made her such a brilliant lawyer. She knew when people were lying, when they were hiding something, when they were afraid. He smiled weakly. You have that same gift, Victoria. I have watched you use it. I learned it from surviving in this family, I said. He laughed, a sound that turned into a cough. When he recovered, his expression had grown more serious. I was not perfect, you know. I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. Grandfather, you do not need to... Let me finish. He reached for my hand, his grip weaker than it had been even a week ago. I let Celia mistreat you for far too long. I saw what she was doing, how she was treating you, and I told myself I was protecting the family by not confronting it directly. I threatened her once when she tried to send you away, but after that I retreated. I watched from a distance instead of fighting for you every single day. You saved me, I said quietly. When I was 7 years old, you saved me from being sent back to the orphanage. One moment of courage does not excuse years of cowardice. His eyes glistened. That was my greatest failure, Victoria. Not the business decisions that went wrong, not the investments that failed. My greatest failure was letting fear of breaking the family apart prevent me from protecting you the way you deserved. I squeezed his hand gently. You protected me when it mattered most, and you gave me the tools to protect myself when I was ready. That is what matters. He smiled at that, a tired but genuine smile. You are too kind to an old man. Eleanor visited every day during those final weeks. She would arrive in the early afternoon after the nurses had finished their morning routines and stay for hours. Sometimes she sat with Thomas, the two of them sharing memories and comfortable silences. Sometimes she sat with me telling stories I had never heard. Did Thomas ever tell you about the first time he met your mother? Eleanor asked one day as we waited for Thomas to wake from a nap. I shook my head. It was in a courtroom. Thomas was sitting at the defendant's table facing the very real possibility of spending the next 20 years in prison. His own lawyers had all but given up. And then this young woman walked in, barely 30 years old, carrying a briefcase stuffed with documents. Eleanor smiled at the memory. She walked right up to the prosecutor and told him she had evidence that would destroy his case. He laughed at her, told her to go back to whatever small firm had sent her. What did she do? She presented her evidence to the judge, right there in open court without waiting for permission. It was highly irregular, bordering on contemptuous. But when the judge saw what she had, he called an immediate recess and demanded to see everything. Eleanor's eyes grew distant. By the end of that week, Thomas was a free man, and the people who had tried to frame him were facing charges of their own. She was brave. She was extraordinary. Eleanor looked at me with an intensity that reminded me of Thomas. There are things that only the old know how to keep, Victoria. Secrets we carry because revealing them would cause more pain than good. Your grandfather and I have kept many secrets over the years. Some of them we will take to our graves. I wondered what she meant by that, but before I could ask, the nurse appeared to tell us Thomas was awake. The following week I could feel the end approaching. Thomas slept more and more, his waking hours growing shorter, his words fewer. The doctors had stopped talking about recovery. Now they spoke only of comfort, of pain management, of making his remaining time as peaceful as possible. One evening, as the sun set outside his window, Thomas called me close. His voice was barely a whisper, but his eyes burned with an urgency I had not seen since his stroke. The wooden box, he said. There is one more envelope. I told Catherine to reveal it only after I am gone. Grandfather, please. You need to rest. No. His hand found mine with surprising strength. I want to tell you myself, face to face, before it is too late. I leaned closer, my heart pounding. There is something about your birth you need to know. He drew a painful breath, each word costing him visible effort. Something I have kept secret for 35 years. Something that will change everything you believe about yourself and your place in this family. What is it? My voice was barely steady. Thomas looked at me with an expression I could not read. Love, certainly, but also fear. And something else, something that looked almost like hope. Your mother and I, he began, then paused to gather his strength. We were not just friends, Victoria. She saw so. What was he about to tell me? What secret had he carried for 35 years? The room was silent, except for the soft beeping of the monitors tracking Thomas's vital signs. The evening light had faded to darkness outside the window, and the only illumination came from a small lamp on the bedside table. In that dim glow, my grandfather's face looked ancient, carved by time, and weighted by the secret he was about to reveal. Your mother and I were not just friends, Victoria. I held my breath waiting. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, gathering the strength to continue. When he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. I did not adopt you only because I promised Margaret I would protect you. I adopted you because you are my daughter, Victoria, my biological daughter. The words did not make sense at first. They hung in the air between us, impossible, incomprehensible. I felt my mind reject them, push them away as some kind of confusion brought on by his illness. Grandfather, I do not understand. I am not your grandfather. His voice broke on the words. I am your father. I have always been your father. The room tilted. I gripped the edge of his bed to steady myself, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. 36 years ago. Thomas continued, each word deliberate and painful. Your mother came to help me with a case review. The trial had just ended, and I wanted her to document everything for the record. We worked late into the night, going through files, reliving the terror of what we had survived. And somewhere in those dark hours, the gratitude I felt for her, the admiration, the connection we had built through months of fighting together, it became something else. He paused, struggling for breath. I wanted to tell him to stop to rest, but I could not speak. I could only listen. We shared one night together, one night that should never have happened. I was married. Margaret knew it was wrong. We both knew. Tears began to roll down his weathered cheeks. The next morning, we agreed to never speak of it again. We pretended it had not happened, buried it so deep that, eventually, I almost convinced myself it was just a dream. But it was not a dream. No. Thomas shook his head slowly. 9 months later, you were born. But Margaret never told me. She never said a word. She raised you alone, never asking me for anything, never giving any indication that you were anyone other than the daughter of some unnamed man who was not in the picture. I thought of the letters in the wooden box, the ones between Thomas and Margaret. The warmth in them, the careful distance. Now I understood what I had been reading. The words of two people who shared something they could never acknowledge. When Margaret died, Thomas continued, I brought you home because I had promised to protect you. I thought I was honouring my debt to a woman who had saved my life. But something did not feel right. The way you looked at me. The shape of your chin. Small things that nagged at my mind. I remembered his words from the dinner weeks ago now. You have your mother's eyes, but that stubborn chin. He had stopped himself, then catching the words before they revealed too much. When you were 15, I had a DNA test done. I took a sample from your hairbrush and sent it to a private laboratory. The results came back conclusive. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. You are my daughter, Victoria, my blood, my child. I could not speak. I could not move. All I could do was sit there as 35 years of my life rearranged themselves around this impossible truth. All those years of feeling like an outsider. All those years of wondering why I did not belong. Why the Banks family could not love me. Why I was different from them in ways I could never articulate. And all along, I was not the stray they had taken in out of charity. I was his daughter. I belonged here more than any of them. Why? The word came out as a croak. Why did you never tell me? Thomas reached for my hand, his grip weak but desperate. Because I wanted to protect you. If I had revealed the truth when you were 15, what would it have done? Destroyed your image of your mother, who had kept this secret to preserve my marriage. Created a scandal that would have followed you for the rest of your life. Traumatized you during the most vulnerable years of adolescence. He squeezed my fingers. I chose to protect you by giving you everything I could without forcing you to carry this burden. The shares I transferred in secret, the inheritance I arranged, the love I showed you every chance I had. But I spent 30 years believing I did not belong. I know. The words came out as a sob. And that is my greatest regret. I thought I was protecting you, but I was also protecting myself, protecting my reputation, my family's stability, the carefully constructed life I had built. I was a coward, Victoria. I should have claimed you as my own from the very beginning. I thought of Celia hating me for reminding her of Margaret. She had been right all along in a way she never knew. I was not just Margaret's daughter. I was the living proof of something that had happened between Thomas and the woman he could never stop praising. I thought of Mark spending his whole life trying to earn his grandfather's love. But Thomas was not his grandfather. Thomas was my father. Mark was not my brother. He was my nephew. I thought of David, the man I had called father for 30 years. He was not my father at all. He never had been. Everything I believed about my place in this family, about who I was and where I came from, had been wrong. Victoria. Thomas's voice pulled me back. When I said you belong to this family, I was not speaking from obligation or duty. You are my family, my blood, my child, the only child I ever truly had. He was weeping openly now, his frail body shaking with emotion. I have loved you from the moment I first saw you, even before I knew the truth. And after I knew, I loved you even more. I looked at this man who had been my anchor for 30 years, my grandfather, my protector, my father. How would I carry this truth forward? Thomas died on a Tuesday morning, 1 week after he told me the truth. I was sitting beside his bed, holding his hand, as I had done every day since our conversation when his breathing changed. It grew shallow, then slower, then stopped altogether. The monitors flatlined with a sound that would echo in my memory forever. I did not cry, not immediately. The grief was too deep for tears, too vast to be contained in something as simple as weeping. I sat there holding his hand for a long time after he was gone, feeling the warmth slowly leave his body, watching his face relax into an expression of peace. The nurse came in, eventually checked his vitals, and gently confirmed what I already knew. She offered condolences, made calls, began the process that follows when a life ends. I watched it all from a distance, feeling as though I were underwater, everything muffled and slow. My father was dead. The word still felt strange in my mind. Father, not grandfather. Father. I had known the truth for only 7 days, and now I would carry it alone for the rest of my life. The funeral was held the following Saturday at a church in Manhattan that Thomas had attended sporadically throughout his life. I had not expected many people to come. Thomas had been private, not one for large social gatherings or public displays. But I had underestimated the impact he had made on the world. Hundreds of people filled the church. Business partners he had worked with over decades, employees of banks' enterprises past and present, old friends from clubs and associations, neighbours from the Upper East Side. The pews were packed and still more people stood along the walls and in the back. I noticed who was there and I noticed who was not. Eleanor sat in the front row, her face drawn, but composed, a woman who had said goodbye to her closest friend. David was beside her, looking lost and sad. Catherine Wells had taken a seat near the middle, paying respects to the man whose legal affairs she had managed for years. But Celia's former social circle was conspicuously absent. The women who had flattered her at charity galas, The couples who had dined at the bank's mansion, the so-called friends, who had surrounded her when she had power and influence. None of them had bothered to come. The people who had once praised Mark as the golden heir of the bank's fortune were nowhere to be seen either. Fair weather connections revealed for what they truly were. Celia herself sat in the back row alone, dressed in simple black. I had not expected her to come at all. But there she was, her head bowed, her hands clasped in her lap. Whatever complicated feelings she had harboured toward Thomas, she had come to say goodbye. When it was time for the eulogy, I walked to the podium on legs that felt uncertain. I looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, most strangers, all waiting to hear what I would say about the man who had shaped my life. I did not speak of the DNA secret. That truth would remain between father and daughter, carried in my heart but never shared with the world. Margaret's memory deserved to remain untarnished. Thomas's final years deserved to be remembered for the good he had done, not the mistakes of his past. Instead, I spoke of what he had taught me. Thomas Banks was not a perfect man, I began. He would be the first to tell you that. He made mistakes, carried regrets, fell short of his own ideals more times than he could count. But he understood something that many people never learn. He understood that loyalty and fairness matter more than blood. I paused, letting the words settle over the congregation. He took in a child who had nothing and gave her everything. Not because he had to, not because anyone expected it, but because he believed that family is not determined by genetics or legal documents. Family is determined by the choices we make, the people we protect, the love we give, even when it costs us something. Tears were flowing in the audience now. Eleanor had her handkerchief pressed to her face. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Thomas taught me that strength is not about power over others. It is about the courage to do what is right, even when it is difficult. It is about standing up for truth, even when lies are easier. It is about protecting the vulnerable, even when no one is watching. I looked toward the back of the church where Celia sat with tears streaming down her face. She was crying harder than anyone else in the room. I will miss him every day for the rest of my life, but I will carry his lessons with me wherever I go, and I will try every single day to be worthy of the love he gave me. I returned to my seat as the service continued. Hymns were sung, prayers were offered, memories were shared, and then it was over, and Thomas Banks was laid to rest beside the wife who had preceded him in death by many years. After the burial, as mourners gathered at the mansion for a reception, I stepped away to be alone for a moment. I stood in the garden Thomas had loved, looking at the roses he had tended with such care. Victoria, I turned to find Mark standing a few feet away. He looked terrible, thinner than I had ever seen him, with dark circles under his eyes and a gauntness to his cheeks that spoke of sleepless nights and missed meals. The arrogant man who had mocked me at the restaurant was gone. In his place was someone humbled by consequence. I am not here to ask for anything, he said quickly, as if afraid I would turn away. I know I have no right to ask you for anything ever again. I waited, saying nothing. I came to apologise. Really apologise. His voice cracked. Not because I need something from you. Not because I am trying to manipulate the situation, but because I need to free myself from my own hatred. He took a shaky breath. I spent my whole life hating you for something that was never your fault. You did not ask to be brought into this family. You did not ask for grandfather's love. You were just a child, and I made you my enemy because I could not face my own inadequacy. I studied his face, looking for signs of deception. I saw only exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine remorse. Could Mark truly change? And what about Celia weeping in the back of the church? 6 months passed after the funeral. Life settled into new patterns, strange and unfamiliar, but gradually becoming routine. I took over leadership of Banks Enterprises, working with the board to restructure operations and restore trust after Mark's departure. I expanded Reynolds Financial Consulting, no longer hiding my success, but embracing it openly. I visited Thomas's grave every Sunday, bringing fresh flowers and sitting in silence with the father I had known for such a short time. I did not think much about Celia during those months. She had retreated from my life as completely as she had once dominated it. No calls, no messages, no appearances at family gatherings that no longer happened. She had become a ghost haunting the edges of a family that had fractured beyond repair. Then the letter arrived. It came on a Tuesday afternoon, tucked between bills and advertisements in my mailbox. A cream-coloured envelope addressed by hand in careful script. No return address, but I recognised the handwriting immediately. I had seen it on birthday cards that contained cheques instead of warmth, on notes left for the household staff, on the adoption dissolution papers that still sat in Thomas's wooden box. Celia. I carried the envelope inside and set it on my kitchen table, staring at it for a long time before I found the courage to open it. Part of me wanted to throw it away unread, to refuse her any more access to my thoughts or emotions, but curiosity won out as it always does. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in the same careful handwriting. No fancy letterhead, no pretentious stationery. Just simple white paper, the kind you buy in bulk at any office supply store. Dear Victoria, it began. I spent 30 years hating an innocent child. I have spent the last 6 months facing that truth, and it has been the hardest thing I have ever done. My therapist tells me that I displaced my own insecurities onto you, that I was so afraid of being inadequate, so threatened by the woman Thomas admired, that I punished you for things you could not control. She says that understanding why I did what I did is the first step toward becoming someone different. I am trying to believe her. I am not writing to ask for forgiveness. I do not deserve forgiveness. What I did to you was cruel and wrong, and no amount of therapy or self-reflection can undo the damage I caused. I stole your childhood. I made you feel worthless in your own home. I tried to send you away when you were just a scared little girl who had already lost everything. There is no apology large enough for that. There are no words that can make it right. But I want you to know that I am trying. Every day I am trying to understand how I became the person I was and how to stop being her. It's slow work and it is painful, and some days I wonder if change is even possible at my age. But I keep trying, because the alternative is to remain the woman who hurt you, and I cannot bear to be her anymore. I will not contact you again unless you want me to. I will not show up at your door, or call your phone, or insert myself into your life in any way. This letter is not an attempt to rebuild a relationship. It is simply an acknowledgement of what I did and who I was. But if someday, years from now, you can look at me without seeing an enemy, I will be grateful. Not because I deserve it, but because it would mean that the hatred I created has finally been laid to rest. I am sorry, Victoria. Those words are inadequate, but they are all I have. Celia. I read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning. The careful word choice is the absence of excuses, the explicit acknowledgement that forgiveness was not expected or deserved. This was not the Celia I had known for 30 years. That Celia would never have admitted fault, never have sought therapy, never have written a letter so stripped of pretense. I did not know how to feel. Part of me wanted to crumple the paper and throw it in the trash, to reject this attempt at reconciliation, the way she had rejected me so many times. Part of me wanted to write back immediately to tell her that I accepted her apology and we could start fresh. Neither impulse felt right, so I did nothing. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, neither accepting nor rejecting what it offered. Maybe I would respond someday. Maybe I never would. For now, the letter would wait. A week later, I shared it with Eleanor over tea at her apartment. She read it slowly, her weathered hands holding the paper with care, her expression thoughtful. "What do you think?" I asked when she finished. Eleanor set the letter down and looked at me with eyes that had seen 72 years of human complexity. I think she means it. Whether she can sustain it, whether she can truly change after a lifetime of being who she was, that remains to be seen. But I believe she means what she wrote. Should I forgive her? Eleanor smiled gently. That is not for me to say. But I will tell you this. Forgiveness is not a gift you give to others. It is a gift you give to yourself. Carrying hatred is heavy, Victoria. It weighs you down, occupies space in your heart that could be used for better things. She reached out and took my hand. You do not have to rush it. Forgiveness that comes too easily is often not real forgiveness at all. It is just avoidance dressed up in pretty clothes. True forgiveness takes time. It requires that the wound be fully acknowledged, fully felt, before it can begin to heal. And if I never forgive her, then that is your right. Eleanor squeezed my hand. But I suspect you will, not because she deserves it, but because you deserve to be free of her. And forgiveness, in the end, is really just another word for freedom. I thanked her and left the letter still in my bag. I had not decided what to do with it yet. What would I build with my inheritance and my freedom? 1 year to the day after Thomas's death, I stood before a building that had once been an abandoned warehouse in the Bronx. The brick facade had been restored and cleaned, the windows replaced with modern glass that caught the morning sunlight. Above the entrance hung a simple sign in elegant letters, the Margaret Reynolds Foundation. Hundreds of people had gathered for the opening ceremony, legal professionals who had volunteered their time, community leaders who had supported the project, families who would benefit from the free legal services we would provide. Eleanor stood near the front, her face beaming with pride. David was there too, camera in hand, documenting everything for the memoir sequel he was already planning. I thought about my mother as I prepared to cut the ribbon. Margaret Reynolds, the young lawyer who had risked everything to save a man she barely knew. The woman who had kept impossible secrets to protect others. The hero I had never really known but whose legacy I now carried forward. The foundation would provide free legal assistance to people who could not afford representation, immigrants facing deportation, families fighting wrongful evictions, workers denied fair wages, the vulnerable and the voiceless, the people Margaret had dedicated her life to protecting. Every case we took would be a continuation of her work, a living memorial more meaningful than any statue or plaque. Banks' enterprises had been transformed under my leadership. I had kept 51% of the shares, maintaining control while distributing the rest to long-term employees and welfare funds. The company now focused on sustainable investments, projects that created real value rather than just short-term profits. We had divested from industries that caused harm and invested in businesses that lifted communities. It was not the empire Thomas had built, but I believed it was something he would have been proud of. The changes had not been easy. Some board members had resisted preferring the old ways of doing business. Some investors had withdrawn their capital, unhappy with lower immediate returns. But slowly, steadily, we had built something new. A company that proved you could do well by doing good. David's memoir had become a surprise bestseller. The Silent Witness. He called it a meditation on the cost of keeping quiet when speaking up matters. Critics praised its honesty, its willingness to examine complicity and cowardice. Without excuses, David had donated half the proceeds to the foundation and used the rest to finally live the life he had always wanted. He travelled extensively now, painting watercolours of landscapes he had only dreamed of seeing during his decades of fearful silence. His apartment was filled with canvases, each one a small act of freedom. Mark's transformation had been slower and harder. After completing his repayment of the embezzled funds, selling everything he owned to meet the deadline, he had taken a job with a small non-profit organisation that provided financial literacy education in underserved communities. The salary was a fraction of what he had earned as CFO, but he seemed more at peace than I had ever seen him. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. His children had become the unexpected bridge between us. Emma and Lucas visited me regularly, now calling me Aunt Victoria with an easy affection that still surprised me. They knew nothing of the complicated history between their father and me, and I intended to keep it that way. Whatever Mark had done, they were innocent, and they deserved to have family connections untainted by adult grievances. Mark and I were not close. We might never be, but we had reached a kind of peace, an acknowledgement that we could coexist without hatred. It was not forgiveness exactly, but it was something. Celia remained on the periphery. She had not attended the foundation opening, which I suspected was deliberate, a way of keeping the distance she had promised in her letter. She was still in therapy, still working on understanding the person she had been. I did not know if she would ever fully change, if decades of ingrained behaviour could truly be undone. But she was trying, and that counted for something. Every Christmas, I sent her a card. Nothing elaborate, just a simple greeting with my signature. She never responded, and I never expected her to. The card was not an invitation to reconciliation. It was simply an acknowledgement that she existed, that I had not erased her from my life entirely. A crack in the door left open for some future day when we might both be ready. After the ribbon-cutting ceremony, after the speeches and the photographs and the tours of the new facility, I retreated to my office on the top floor. The room was simply furnished, nothing like the ornate spaces of the bank's mansion. Just a desk, some chairs, and a window overlooking the neighbourhood we would serve. I sat down and pulled the final envelope from my bag, the last item from Thomas's wooden box, the one he had told Catherine to hold until after he was gone. I had carried it with me for a year, waiting for the right moment to open it. Today, standing in a building dedicated to my mother's memory, felt like that moment had arrived. The envelope was old, the paper yellowed with age. Thomas had written on the front in his careful hand, "For Victoria. Open when you are ready." I broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. "My dearest child," it began. "When you read this, I will be gone. I hope you have found a moment of peace to sit with these words, a quiet space where you can hear my voice one last time. I want you to know something important. The real legacy I leave behind is not money or companies or property. Those things are tools, nothing more. The real legacy is the lives changed through kindness, the people helped, the injustices corrected, the love given without expectation of return. Your mother changed my life, not just by saving me from prison, but by showing me what courage and integrity truly look like. She taught me that one person standing firm for what is right can move mountains. You changed this family, not through revenge or destruction, but through strength and grace. You broke cycles that had repeated for generations. You showed us all a better way. And now, this foundation will change countless others. Every person helped, every case when every injustice fought, will be a continuation of what your mother started and what you have carried forward. You spent so many years searching for belonging, trying to find your place in a family that did not know how to love you. But I want you to understand something now. At the end of all things, you never needed to belong anywhere. You create belonging wherever you go. You build it with your actions, your choices, your refusal to become bitter, despite everything that was done to you. I love you forever. I loved you from the moment I first saw you, before I knew the truth. And I loved you even more after I understood who you really were. Your father, Thomas. P.S. I have always been proud to be your dad. The tears came, then falling freely down my cheeks. But they were not tears of grief. They were tears of healing, of release, of a wound finally allowed to close. For 30 years I had been the invisible daughter, searching for belonging in a family that did not want me. Now at last I understood. I had never needed their acceptance. I had never needed their love. I created my own belonging, built my own family, forged my own place in the world. The invisible daughter had become visible, on her own terms, in her own way, and this was only the beginning. And so ends the story of Victoria Banks, the invisible daughter, who found her voice and claimed her rightful place in the world. When I first began to tell you this story, I wondered if you would see yourself in Victoria, the outsider looking in, the one who tries so hard to be accepted, to be loved, only to be pushed away again and again. Perhaps you have known what it feels like to sit at a table surrounded by people who call themselves your family, yet feel completely alone. Victoria's journey teaches us something important. She did not become whole by finally receiving the acceptance she had craved for 30 years. She became whole when she stopped seeking it from people who could not give it. She built her own life, her own success, her own family of choice. She transformed her pain into purpose and her wounds into wisdom. We all carry invisible wounds. We all have moments when we feel like we do not belong. But like Victoria, we have the power to choose what those wounds will make us. We can let them turn us bitter, or we can let them make us stronger. We can spend our lives trying to earn love from those who cannot give it, or we can create love wherever we go. The invisible daughter is invisible no more, and neither are you. If this story touched your heart, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me what part of her journey moved you most. Was it the moment Thomas revealed the truth? Was it when David finally found his courage? Or was it Victoria's choice to show mercy to those who had shown her none? Your stories matter too. If you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever fought for belonging only to discover you had to create it yourself, share your experience. You might be surprised how many others have walked that same path. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Every subscription helps us continue bringing these stories to life, and every comment lets us know that these words are reaching hearts that need them. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, you have the power to create belonging wherever you go. Until next time.